So the ancient Ge'ez scripture, well, it wasn't destroyed. Instead, it was intentionally hushed, buried deep within the Vatican's secret repositories. You know, where prohibited volumes rest beneath layers of history. Miles beneath the marble squares of Rome, a forgotten script just lingers in ink, preserved behind sealed chambers that no researcher may access. It's mentioned only in the dim corners of historical accounts. It is more than just a fictional tale. It is an authentic enigma the Vatican desperately hoped to contain. If you are intrigued by narratives involving concealed history, missing holy writings, and hushed secrets, remember to follow this channel. There are still many more Vatican puzzles lurking in the darkness. So relax, close your eyes, and allow the quiet to be our guide. Tonight we will cautiously enter the obscured corners of the past, somewhere deep below the stone floors of Vatican City, where age adheres to the rock and murmurs settle into dust. A lonely lamp flickers inside a neglected space. The small fire illuminates aged walls covered with papers that no modern scholar has observed. A faint smell of beeswax and fragile parchment fills the motionless air. Somewhere within this hushed maze of shelves and scrolls, a volume remains, inscribed in a language long silenced, its voice muffled not by the passage of time but by a deliberate act. This is not the section of the Vatican most tourists envision. Visitors look up at majestic ceilings and gilded domes, but the real narratives are hidden far beneath. There are passages here that are absent from every directory, where only certain people possess the entry keys, and in one of those passages, behind a secure metal entrance with no sign, a humble archivist once discovered something he was never meant to witness. His name was Father Nicodemus. Not a high-ranking official, just a simple man assigned the duty of duplicating and restoring delicate writings. He had spent 30 years in silence, carefully painting ink onto parchment, mending the damaged leaves of ancient accounts. But on a cold evening in 1973, he received instructions to organise a collection for reclassification. The instruction was not signed, sealed with crimson wax, and offered no clarification, only a location number and a strict caution. Do not duplicate, do not review. But how could he refuse? The file was bound in dark leather, its edges worn and curving. Inside were pages that felt unfamiliar to his touch. Not fine paper, not animal skin. Something entirely different. The writing shimmered subtly beneath the lamplight, and the style he had never encountered was not Latin. It was not Greek. The symbols flowed like smoke, defined and soft, simultaneously, as if meant to be sighed, not clearly stated. Later, he would discover the name of the dialect. Ge'ez, the sacred vernacular of an early Christian civilization far from the influence of Rome, a world the Vatican had striven to erase. He was apprehended the next morning. The folder disappeared. The shelves were reorganized. Father Nicodemus was quietly transferred to a religious house in southern Spain. But before his departure, he confided in one individual, a young Jesuit copyist who would never forget the expression in his eyes. "They instructed me never to mention it again," he murmured. "But that book, it was not merely old, it was dangerous." And so the secret begins, not in the bright light of St. Peter's Basilica, but in a chamber lit only by a faint lamp, where silence is heavier than rock, and a single forgotten book still waits to be discovered. The script within that volume, the one Father Nicodemus briefly uncovered, belongs to a tongue few in the contemporary world can interpret. It is called Ge'ez. Some claim it is the tongue of divine messengers. Others believe it is the missing voice of a civilization that once flourished, where only quiet now presides. In any case, it is one of the most ancient documented languages in human history, and its words still survive in holy writings concealed far from view. Ge'ez was formerly the dialect of the Kingdom of Axum, a mighty Christian empire located in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. This kingdom existed long before the Vatican became prominent, and its scribes started inscribing in Ge'ez as early as the first few centuries following the birth of Christ. While Rome was debating religious principles in elaborate halls, Ethiopian clerics were quietly copying old scriptures manually, using dark and red inks on pliable parchment, guided only by the flame and their devotion. But here is the aspect most people overlook. Ge'ez was not just a regional dialect, it was the writing of a completely distinct Christian heritage, one that did not develop under the authority of Rome. It honoured its own holy figures, its own gospel narratives, and in certain instances, it preserved sections of the Bible that the Western Church opted to discard. This is why when Ge'ez documents began to appear in Europe during the Age of Exploration, they created quiet apprehension. Priests in Rome would examine these unusual writings with titles they did not know: the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, all recorded in Ge'ez, all diligently protected by Ethiopian monks and none incorporated into the official Catholic Bible. Scholars began to question, why did these volumes endure in Africa but vanish from the West? And what might they unveil if examined again? The Vatican's reaction was slow, reserved. Some manuscripts were discreetly taken for examination. Others were confined. A few were returned, but only after specific passages were translated, then obscured with ink so they could not be read again. In private communications, bishops characterized Ge'ez as an interesting remnant of a past world. But beneath those formal descriptions lay worry. For if the Ge'ez Bible retained a version of Christian history unaffected by Rome, then what else had been left out? What secrets had been kept safe, not by the Vatican, but by time, isolation, and the determination of a disregarded community? And perhaps most disturbingly, why does the Vatican still decline to address it? Long before the Vatican erected its first stone pillar, the high plateaus of East Africa resonated with hymns and prayers in a tongue born from dirt, rock, and stillness. That tongue was Ge'ez. It did not originate in Rome or Greece. It grew internally, shaped by the mountains, the wind, and the profound belief of a population who resided far from the core of Europe, but closer, perhaps, to something much older. According to oral tradition, Ge'ez did not start as a literary tongue. It began as a melody. Clerics and poets would recite their devotions aloud, using tempo and pitch to convey meaning across valleys where paper was yet unknown. The earliest iterations of Ge'ez were never intended for writing. They were uttered into the atmosphere, committed to memory, and passed from older to younger generations like a lasting echo of the divine. But then circumstances changed. Around the 4th century, following a powerful conversion led by a Syrian Christian named Frumentius, the kingdom of Axum became one of the first Christian empires on earth. Centuries before European monarchs would bow before the cross, Ethiopian emperors were building stone sanctuaries and translating holy narratives into Ge'ez. What had been an oral tradition became a written one, and what had been a local accent became a holy script. Scribes carved the letters of Ge'ez into tall stone monuments and copied them with brush and ink onto parchment made from animal hide. They worked in silence, deep inside religious communities, carved into steep rock faces where light barely reached the floor. These were not just duplicators, they were custodians, and they held a quiet conviction that their work would outlast rulers and nations. And it did. But something about Ge'ez unsettled other authorities. It contained narratives that did not align with the familiar rhythm of Western holy writing. Its sacred texts included accounts of heavenly beings who defied orders, visions of parallel dimensions, and lines of descent that connected Ethiopia not only to Christ, but to Solomon himself. It depicted early Christianity not as a single stream originating from Rome, but as a network of waterways, each sacred, each legitimate. By the time European envoys arrived centuries later, they were astonished, not because Ethiopia had converted, but because it had never needed to. It had always believed independently, without Rome's consent. For the Vatican, this reality presented a silent complication, a religious body that never required their approval, a dialect that communicated the same truth but in an unconventional manner, and so the narrative of Ge'ez born in the highlands began to disappear from geographical maps, from religious addresses, and eventually from collective memory, but not from stone, not from the parchment sealed beneath Vatican floors, and not from those who still recall its sound echoing softly across the cliffs, waiting for recognition once more. Ge'ez was never merely a language for those who wrote in it, prayed in it, and lamented in it. Ge'ez was a celestial voice, a sacred connection linking the temporal to the divine. In ancient Ethiopian monasteries, monks believed that divine messengers once communicated in Ge'ez, that it was not invented but divinely revealed, a script of quiet reverence and spirituality intended not for everyday discourse, but only for holy matters. When a scribe prepared to copy the sacred writings into Ge'ez, he did not begin with the inkwell. He began with supplication, then stillness, then fasting. Only after his hands were cleansed and his thoughts cleared would he apply the ink brush to the prepared surface. Every word a devotion, every symbol a commitment. And once a line was finished, it was whispered aloud, as if to give it life. Inside these documents are narratives both recognizable and peculiar. The Gospels, certainly, but also forgotten revelations and long-lost books. One text refers to the celestial being Surafel, who directed the sacred chest across the desert. Another recounts the Virgin Mary's early years, a story not found in Western Bibles, but preserved in detail through Ge'ez alone. There are even spiritual songs, not composed by David, but by a queen whose name is absent from Roman registries. And in one manuscript currently kept behind locked doors in Rome, there is a section describing heavenly beings writing alongside humans, not metaphorically, but literally, their hands guiding the ink, their presence concealed just over the scribe's shoulder. The Vatican does not dispute the existence of these writings, but they do not speak of them either. When asked, they state the documents are under research, and yet, for decades, those who have researched them have quietly withdrawn from public life. One account speaks of a visiting academic from Belgium. In the year 1957, he was granted rare entrance to the Ethiopian collection within the Vatican Library. For 3 days, he worked under strict supervision. On the 4th day, he requested a duplicate of a particular volume marked with crimson thread. He was informed it could not be located. That same evening, his hotel room was emptied, his notes removed, his identity erased from the guest register. All that remained was a single phrase scribbled on the reverse side of a receipt found weeks later, tucked into a returned book. They were not afraid of the words. They were afraid of who might still be inscribing them. Perhaps the divine messengers have ceased writing, perhaps not, but the ink remains dry and anticipating, locked in shadowed halls where no lamp burns. And still the Vatican maintains its silence, not with denial, but with something far more confirming. In Ethiopia, quiet carries a different connotation. It is not always apprehension, sometimes it is preservation. In the high plateaus, where the atmosphere is thin and the rocks appear to breathe with age, there is a story every child knows. It is recited near firelight and sung in the ancient monasteries carved into red stone. It speaks of a sacred chest that once departed Jerusalem and never came back. They claim it arrived in Ethiopia, carried not by warriors, but by sheer conviction itself, and wherever the Ark of the Covenant travelled, the language of the heavens followed, the Ge'ez script that recorded its journey. According to the Kebra Nagast, the ancient royal account of Ethiopia, the Ark was brought from Solomon's temple by Menelik, the son of Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba. The narrative asserts that Menelik, born of 2 civilizations, returned to his mother's dominion carrying the holy tablets of Moses. Along with them, He brought the divine script of Ge'ez, the tongue, utilized by clerics and divine messengers alike. That was the genesis of the Solomonic line, a dynasty that claimed direct ancestry from Israel's greatest king. For centuries, the Ethiopian emperors believed they were the genuine custodians of God's promise. Their royal headwear featured the symbol of the Star of David, and their seats of power rested on stone altars said to contain remnants from Jerusalem itself. It was this unbroken assertion that gave Ethiopia a sense of holiness untouched by Rome. And it was this same assertion that caused discomfort for the Vatican. In the mid-16th century, Jesuit envoys reached Ethiopia with directives to unify the Church with Rome. They admired the dedication of the Ethiopian clergy, but they were troubled by their discoveries. The Ge'ez Bible included entire sections absent from Latin writings. The spiritual songs were lengthier, the laws were older, and the ark, according to their hosts, was not symbolic. It was genuine, and it rested in a shrine in the northern settlement of Axum. When reports of this reached the Vatican, some dismissed them as folklore, but others took them seriously. Communications were exchanged, missions discreetly financed, and a small group was sent to verify relics of biblical interest. None of their findings were ever made public. The documents were classified, and the individuals who had authored them were relocated to various assignments before the year concluded. The link between Ge'ez and the Ark was quietly removed from religious doctrine soon after. Yet the speculation never faded. Every few years, someone purports to have seen the Ark in Axum. Every few years, another Vatican academic is dispatched to study the Ethiopian texts, and still no one speaks. Perhaps the Vatican's silence is not meant to conceal a legend, but to safeguard a truth older than Rome itself, a truth engraved in stone, recorded in Ge'ez, and protected by those who still believe the Ark never departed their land. Somewhere deep within the apostolic archive, beyond chambers no map will indicate, there lies a small earth-toned container that is never kept on public shelves. Its corners are wrapped in aged fabric, and a thread of crimson string seals it shut. There is no designation, no author, no date, only a quiet reminder placed inside its cover, written in careful penmanship. Not for public viewing, not for reproduction, for authorized personnel only. The document inside has no title. Its pages are rough and heavy, made not from paper but from prepared animal skin, stretched and darkened over time. The script is in Ge'ez, but unlike other documents housed in the Vatican, this one has been tampered with. Edges have been scraped clean, passages carefully removed with a slender blade. Some words, written in a shaky hand, have been overwritten with Latin as if to mask their meaning without fully eliminating it. According to a retired Vatican cataloguer who spoke only once and never again, the manuscript came from Axum in the early 20th century. It was presented, or perhaps acquired, by a visiting academic who had pledged to preserve it. When he reached Rome, he was welcomed, thanked, and quietly asked to relinquish the volume. He never left the city. His identity was removed from university records 3 years later. What makes the manuscript so disturbing is not what is visible in it, but what has been excised. A complete gospel, missing from every version of the Bible known in the West, was once copied here in its entirety. But now only its impressions remain. Spaces between lines, a missing flow, an absent voice. Some speculate it was the Gospel of Mary in its original form before Rome modified it into fragments. Others believe it contained the full Book of Enoch, with lines that describe not only divine messengers who fell, but those who endured and the warnings they left behind. A few whisper that the manuscript tells of the Ark not as a relic, but as a dynamic agreement. Not wood and precious metal, but something that still functions. Whatever it contained, it is evident the Vatican deemed it too risky to expose. The fabric that wraps it is replaced every 2 decades, always by hand, never with tools. No electronic image has ever been authorized. No academic has been granted full entry since the year 1975. It remains enveloped in quiet, guarded not by personnel, but by being overlooked. A volume no longer studied, no longer discussed, and yet it still rests on a shelf where the lamplight never reaches, as if waiting for someone who already comprehends the conclusion. In the quiet depths of the Vatican Library, where the air smells of old documents and polished timber, there are chambers that do not appear in any index. Long hallways extend behind secured panels, and the further one goes, the fewer names appear on the shelves. In one of these chambers, located past a series of narrow risers and decorative wooden entrances, lies a forgotten section where Gayez documents have been placed. Not examined, not shared, merely stored. No signage marks the entry. No descriptions explain what is inside. To locate it, one must already know of its existence, and even then, nothing is correctly placed. Scrolls are hidden behind volumes that seem unrelated. Leather-bound books with gold stitching have no title visible on the spine. Containers are piled in irregular stacks, sealed in cloth or fastened with faded red rope. There are no tags, no organisational numbers, only quiet and the subtle sound of pages turning where no visitors are permitted. One Jesuit cleric who served as an aide in the archives during the early 1990s later wrote in his personal notes that the Gayez collection was deliberately chaotic. He believed it was not accidental. These texts, he wrote, were not organised like the Latin ones, nor preserved in climate-controlled vaults like the Greek manuscripts. They were maintained just far enough out of reach to be present, but never fully accessible. The reason, he suspected, was not deterioration or oversight. It was apprehension. Not of the language itself, but of the uncertainties it presented. Many of the texts in Gayez included prophetic books, apocalyptic visions, and alternate family histories of Christ. Some even suggested female disciples and early practices that predated Roman doctrine. To fully open those pages, to translate them completely, would be to acknowledge that the history of the Church is not a single clear path, but a woven blend of opposing truths. There was one document in particular that concerned him, a collection of short narratives not found in any known gospel. One tale described a teacher who did not construct sanctuaries, but taught beneath trees, near rivers, and in rocky shelters. His followers were not apostles, but marginalised people. The final sentence, he said, was written in pale red ink. What cannot be buried cannot be commanded. He copied the phrase by hand onto a scrap of paper and kept it concealed in the lining of his garment. The paper was found years later, long after he had departed Rome, but the manuscript it originated from was never seen again. Inside this unlisted archive, history does not sleep. It waits, unmarked and unmentioned, as if challenging the Vatican to recall what it decided to forget. In the year 1979, a young Jesuit copyist named Luca was assigned to assist with document preservation in one of the lesser-known passages beneath the Apostolic Palace. He was reserved, compliant, and proficient with ancient dialects, though not yet permitted direct access to the more contentious vaults. His duty was simple: clean and bind delicate texts retrieved from old storage areas. But as he worked day after day, he noticed something unusual. A long corridor branched off the archive's southern section. It was absent from all blueprints, and unlike the rest of the library, it was consistently dimly lit, even during the brightest hours. The stone arch over its entrance was marked with faint symbols, some in Latin, others in Gayez, smoothed by time. No one ever entered or exited. When he questioned a senior archivist about it, he was told it was used for outdated storage. But Luca's curiosity grew. Late one evening, as the main archive staff left for Vespers, Luca stayed behind. Under the pretense of finishing a repair, he waited for quiet, then crossed the threshold into the prohibited corridor. He would later state that the air changed the instant he entered. It smelled like metal and lamp smoke. The walls narrowed, the shelves grew taller, and the quiet was different. Not peaceful, but watchful. Inside, he discovered rows of manuscripts tied in bundles, many recorded in Ge'ez, though the script was older, almost rudimentary. Some were duplicates of familiar writings, but others were entirely unknown. One scroll, unrolled carefully, displayed a diagram not of geography but of symbols linked together by faded red lines. At the centre was a simple sketch of the Ark of the Covenant, but instead of resting in Jerusalem, it was marked in the mountains of Ethiopia. He was reaching for another scroll when he perceived footsteps behind him. Not loud, but steady, as if someone already anticipated his presence. Luca never discussed what happened next until decades later, when he was living in quiet retirement near Florence. He said he was not punished, he was not scolded. Instead, he was summoned into a small chamber the next morning and given an opportunity not to be dismissed, but to remain with one condition: never speak of the corridor again. He agreed. He stayed, and for 10 more years he worked within the Vatican's deepest chambers, cataloguing texts the world was never informed existed. His first-hand report was documented, not on paper or in a treatise, but on the edge of a Ge'ez-copied psalm book, one phrase etched in scarlet. Some entries are sealed closed not to prevent our exit. They are secured because of what is hidden inside. The Holy See never replied, and the passage, according to existing archives, is no longer there, but the mechanisms remain silent, polished, and contemporary. Unlike the oxidized bolts and timber entrances of the elder sections, these are crafted from chrome, chilling to the touch and fitted with coded panels that never flicker. Beyond them rest the most ancient parchments known to the faith. Not torn or lost, but concealed. Pages inscribed in Ge'ez, placed in containers without identification, guarded by total quiet. Why would such long-ago writings require high-tech locks if the reason is more than mere protection? The true motivation might not lie within the documents themselves, but in the power they represent. These pages do not merely hold forgotten dogma. They directly challenge the control framework that has defined the Church for countless years. Ge'ez writings frequently illustrate a form of Christianity that is older, distinct, and separate from Rome, a tradition that venerates the Messiah, but not in the way Western theology has codified him. One specific volume, only mentioned in hushed tones by scholars, describes a sermon delivered by the Lord not atop a mountain, but within a cavern illuminated by oil lamps, where his teachings were recorded by 2 female disciples. This narrative, if authentic, precedes the official Gospel of Mark, yet the Church never integrated it into its official teachings. The volume is penned in flowing Ge'ez script, complete with small drawings in the margin depicting grapevines, celestial bodies, and a crowned lion. The official crest of Ethiopia. A duplicate of this piece surfaced briefly in the calendar year 1968, when a researcher visiting from Cairo claimed to have captured images of several folios during a trip to the Vatican archives. Within a matter of weeks, the researcher's clearance was revoked, his apparatus was seized, and upon returning to his apartment, he discovered it had been searched. The images were never disseminated. Many years later, when questioned about that episode, he simply stated, "Certain information is permitted, certain information is not." And this is the consistent trend. When scrolls in Roman or Hellenic are unearthed, they are restored and analysed. When they appear in Ge'ez, they are managed differently, discreetly, covertly, and put away. The very dialect seems to possess a gravity, as if speaking in Ge'ez could unlock doors Rome has spent hundreds of years sealing shut. A single Vatican source, speaking on the condition of anonymity, put it this way: "We do not conceal them because we fear what their message states. We conceal them because we are certain of their truth." And a truth that exists outside Roman authority is perpetually hazardous. The security systems may be digital now, utilizing sequences instead of physical keys, but the initial reason for their existence has not been altered. The prehistoric pages secured behind them are not dangerous due to their antiquity. but because they have survived without official consent. They serve as proof of a history the Vatican neither created nor can destroy. And in the hush of those sealed chambers, the question remains unspoken. If this truth is harmless, why must it be kept behind a security combination? Far beyond the thick granite structures of the Holy See, in the rugged northern plateaus of Ethiopia, a sound was carried on the movement of air. A subtle murmuring from Tigray. It emerged not from a repository, but from a holy site carved into the precipices, where the movement of time is slow and the contemporary world seems distant by centuries. There, enveloped in goat hide and secured with tree resin, was a long, narrow text that should have been non-existent. Its discovery was an accident, or so the account goes. A junior cleric had been organising a neglected storage area behind the holy table when he noticed a slight space in the masonry. Inside, hidden beneath aged priestly attire and shattered religious artworks, was a long, thin object wrapped in fine cloth that disintegrated when touched. He presented it to the most senior priest, who carefully unrolled it with unsteady hands. What they beheld was more than just old. It was completely undisturbed, and its entire content was composed in Ge'ez. News of the finding spread rapidly, too rapidly. Within a few weeks, Vatican representatives stationed in Addis Ababa quietly asked to inspect the ancient text for official confirmation. But the chief priest refused. He declared the document was not intended for foreign inspection. It had stayed concealed for an important reason, and that reason was still valid. What made the text so crucially important was not merely its language, but its entire subject matter. It contained an eyewitness narrative of a profound vision, not from an inspired figure or a holy person, but from a woman. Her name was not documented in any established Western accounts, but in the text she was referred to as Mariam, the one who attends. As stated in the document, she received the words of a heavenly messenger who revealed to her the secrets of the initial religious community. Secrets that directly contradicted the established Roman timeline. A specific excerpt, later secretly transported in a manually written copy, detailed a community of early adherents who practiced ceremonial washing without clerical involvement, sought divine pardon without formal confession, and participated in a symbolic meal without the traditional bread or drink. They gathered after sunset beneath the visible stars and communicated in a language more ancient than the religious law. The document also noted a structure, a modest shrine featuring 7 stone columns that corresponded to ruins found deep within the Tigray region, long thought to be pre-Christian in origin. If accurate, the document indicated those ruins were not pagan, but part of an early Christian lineage that existed before Rome asserted its control. The Holy See released no official statement. But soon after, the sacred site was visited by unidentified individuals who offered a substantial donation in return for the text. Again, the religious community declined. A few days later, the surrounding area suddenly experienced civil disorder, and the sacred site was closed off to all external parties. The current location of the ancient text is now unknown. Some believe it remains hidden within the inner structure, safeguarded by those who still respect its message. Others speculate it was covertly removed and now rests, unseen, behind a locked Vatican entrance. In either scenario, what was written in Ge'ez on that day was never meant to be uncovered. Yet, it was. What happens when a truth is too dangerous to officially deny but too destabilizing to fully endorse? The Holy See has never exclusively relied on violence or intimidation to manage controversial knowledge. Instead, it has developed something far more subtle, a technique quieter than official censorship, more lasting than outright destruction. It is not a rule documented in public decrees, but those who study history are familiar with its designation. The principle of containment. The core concept is straightforward, yet incredibly potent. When confronted with documents, beliefs, or new discoveries that challenge established doctrine, the Church does not always eliminate them. Instead, it contains them, puts them into storage, and isolates them behind barriers that are both physical and academic. In this way, nothing is truly lost, but nothing is actively accessed. This method originated centuries ago. In its earliest phases, texts categorized as unorthodox were put to fire. But over time, the Vatican realized that destroying knowledge created gaps, rumors, and unresolved questions in the historical record. And so a new methodology emerged, one based on deliberate omission, not burning. An early Gaia's Gospel, discovered in the city of Alexandria, was not destroyed. It was duplicated, inadequately translated into the Latin tongue, and then permanently shelved in the deepest recesses of the archive, far removed from any public request. When a scholar requested access in the year 1928, he was informed that it was currently undergoing official review. That review was never concluded. The procedure is identical for visions, correspondence, or even physical objects. If a finding originating from Ethiopia includes concepts not supported by Roman theology, such as female figures holding important religious authority, or the Messiah teaching outside of a formal temple, it is set aside, categorized, and refiled with vague descriptions such as pre-canonical evidence or unverified scriptural notes. The containment method functions not solely through hidden shelves, but through the strict management of interpretation. A leading cleric may acknowledge a text's existence, but will officially classify it as a metaphor, a myth, or simply a mistranslation. The original scroll is genuine, they may argue, but its intended meaning should not be accepted literally. And in that quiet reclassification, the potential threat is silently neutralized. One former official from the Holy See described it as the gentle barrier. Not an official prohibition, not a direct warning, but simply a subtle redirection. Most people do not even realize they are being turned away. The source material still exists somewhere, but its intended message has been muffled, its original language misconstrued, and its central truth surrounded by polite academic skepticism. But occasionally, something manages to escape. A translated Gaia's text anonymously shipped to a major university in Prague. A quickly taken photo of a concealed shelf before the illumination was dimmed. A hushed phrase repeated in the weekly sermon of a priest who never fully revealed the source of his information. The principle of containment is not a punitive enclosure. It is an armoured repository, not meant to shield the global populace from potential harm, but to shield the institutional church from a singular truth that might simultaneously unlock too many mysteries. And still, those access points remain shut, but not permanently locked, not in every instance. Language, when left undefended, holds the capability to unlock more than just physical entrances. It can dismantle established systems, shift power, and reawaken historical forgotten facts. This is why the Holy See, despite all its historical power, remains deeply apprehensive, not only about the nature of the message, but about the precise manner in which it is stated and the native tongue used. The Gaia's language, seen as sacred and inflexible, presents one of the Church's greatest quiet dilemmas. It is more than just a writing system. It is a protective vessel for historical narratives that have endured completely unaltered by Roman influence. It conveys original voices that were never filtered through the official Latin tongue or bent by multiple translations. In Gaia's, an early gospel can convey a profoundly different message, not merely in emotional emphasis, but in core theology. Hierarchical titles shift, personal names are changed, and meanings blossom in directions the Holy See did not foresee. And that inherent possibility is in itself a form of risk. There was one particular excerpt discovered in a Gaia's document concealed inside an Ethiopian religious site. It depicted the final ceremonial meal not as a formal ritualized event, but as a quiet gathering beneath a solitary tree, featuring no bread, no wine, only shared communal talk. In the Latin telling, this pivotal moment becomes a formal rite, the very basis of the sacrament of communion. But in Ge'ez, it transforms into something else entirely, something that cannot be successfully confined within official religious practice. A female scholar, Sister Eloisa, served as an expert translator for an official Vatican research group in the year 1974. Her academic specialization was ancient Semitic dialects. When she began her work with Ge'ez, she was immediately struck by the undeniable recurring patterns. She noticed phrases that implied complete equality among the primary disciples, religious teachings conveyed by both male and female figures, and specific instructions that advocated for spiritual practice through silent reflection instead of rigid structure. She formally presented her research notes to the official review council. 3 weeks later, her specialized project was officially reassigned. Her official name was completely removed from the final published document. She was never extended an invitation to translate another text. When asked about the event many years later, she only commented, "Words possess the ability to construct immense sacred buildings, but they also possess the ability to shake them to their foundations." This is the underlying quiet fear behind the Vatican's current strategy of containment, that a singular ancient language unmodified by centuries of Roman revision might carry historical truths that cannot be easily dismissed. In Ge'ez, the religious faith was not dispersed through military domination. It was not formalized by large religious gatherings. It flourished in remote caverns, beneath the vast open sky, and in complete silence. A deep faith shaped not by official decree, but by personal, sincere commitment. And in every single symbol of that language, there remains the permanent memory of an early church that existed entirely independent of Rome. To successfully unlock an early Ge'ez manuscript is not only an act of reading, it is an act of deep listening. And sometimes what is heard cannot be easily ignored. This is the precise reason the language was never officially forbidden, only slowly buried. Why the ancient books were never completely burned, only carefully boxed away. Because even now, after centuries of systemic control, the Holy See fully understands what Ge'ez truly represents. Not merely a spoken language, but a definitive key. And definitive keys, once they are located, inevitably find their intended door. But some doors are permanently sealed, some are secured, not with mechanical locks, but with actual flames. In the immense historical shadow of the institutional church, there is a distinct contrast that endures like faint smoke in a very old room. The brilliant violence of books set ablaze and the cold quiet of historical archives both accomplish the identical purpose. One acts to completely erase, the other acts to effectively bury. There was a time when fire was the primary instrument of choice. In the 15th and 16th centuries, when the concept of heresy was feared like a widespread illness, official libraries across the entire European continent were meticulously searched for any texts that did not conform to the established model. Ancient manuscripts were publicly dragged into central courtyards and ignited with burning torches. In one documented instance from the year 1532, a Jesuit priest confessed to the official burning of a large chest filled with Eastern origin writings, which included long scrolls sent directly from the Ethiopian high plateaus. He later composed, "It is far better that they become ash than create widespread doubt." But fire always leaves behind traces: ash, burned fragments, enduring memory, and persistent questions, always questions. In the fullness of time, the Holy See became aware that deliberate quiet was far more potent than smoke. That procedural change became abundantly clear within the Vatican Library itself. As the official archives expanded, certain key texts were deliberately removed from public shelves and placed in completely sealed rooms, not because they were structurally damaged, not because they were confirmed to be fraudulent, but simply because they were true and inconvenient to the narrative. Some were transcribed in Ge'ez, others in Coptic or Syriac. Many were alternative translations of the exact same Gospels, already officially canonized, but with minor discrepancies, small alterations. A single word added in one place, a whole sentence removed in another. Enough difference to cause disruption, enough to prompt an inquiry into which version truly came first. A specific priest named Matteo was formally assigned to review these duplicate versions. In the year 1961, he worked in a small room known among staff as the Silent Strong Room. Its interior walls were completely lined with unmarked boxes that had not been officially opened in many decades. Inside one, he discovered a Ge'ez handwritten copy of the Gospel of Luke, complete, manually transcribed, and definitively older than any official known Latin version. In this specific version, the final recorded statements of the Messiah were not "it is completed," but "it begins." Matteo promptly wrote a detailed report. He marked its classification as urgent. He delivered it personally by hand. The document was officially received, courteously acknowledged, filed away, and never mentioned again in any official capacity. Matteo was later formally reassigned to a new teaching position in a rural countryside parish. When asked what he had truly gained from his extended time in the archive, he replied with a simple truth: the institutional church does not forget. It simply places a memory in a location where no one is currently looking. Today, that original manuscript remains permanently sealed in the identical strong room. Its identification label is blank, its specific shelf unlisted in the catalogue, and its truth completely untouched. For within the Vatican, not every flame burns with visible light. Some merely flicker without producing any measurable heat, hidden deep behind thick stone and the passing of time. And in that profoundly quiet, often overlooked corner of history, the Church continues its very oldest ceremonial practice. Not one of fire, but one of prolonged silence. But even prolonged silence must be carefully managed. And for centuries, the Holy See maintained a specific list. Not a public ledger of treasured holy objects or officially sanctioned sacred writings, but a much darker record, a detailed ledger of potential risk, fundamental doubt, and definitively forbidden knowledge. Its designated title was the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the official registry of forbidden texts. Officially, it was an advisory handbook. In truth, it functioned as a definitive map of institutional anxiety, a comprehensive list not only of what the Church worried others might secretly read, but also of what it worried it might have once previously believed. The index first made its official appearance in the mid-16th century. Most people recognize it for its prohibition of printed texts that directly challenged prevailing Catholic doctrine, works by the astronomer Galileo, the reformer Luther, or early philosophers who actively stirred up controversy. But few were aware that handwritten texts were formally listed too, and completely hidden within its later chronological volumes were quiet, subtle entries that obliquely referred to Ethiopian scrolls, various unnamed early Gospels, and highly obscure Ge'ez manuscripts. They were never publicly listed in any direct way. The veiled entries utilized ambiguous language, using phrases such as documents of dubious origin from Abyssinian religious communities or texts of non-Latin provenance with unauthorized apostolic accounts. But behind those vague general lines were highly specific targets, historical documents preserved for centuries in Ge'ez. Most of them were never formally translated into any major Western dialect. Some of these specific texts recounted historical events already familiar to the Church, but with subtle yet fundamentally dangerous variations. One particular scroll described the physical resurrection of the Messiah as an event witnessed not by the primary apostles but by a select group of women in the remote hills, one of whom was explicitly said to communicate directly with the divine entity. Another Ge'ez document contained a version of the foundational Genesis story in which the act of creation was not fully completed in a strict 7-day period, but was left open, perpetually ongoing, a radically transformative concept that completely undermined centuries of fixed theological doctrine. Cardinal Alfredo Malvasia, one of the official curators of the Index in the initial 19th century, wrote in a private letter that these Ge'ez texts were not heresy in the conventional definition, but heresy of chronology. He openly feared that they clearly demonstrated a form of Christianity that had organically developed entirely without Roman influence and, worse, had fundamentally survived. "We have a duty to preserve them," he wrote, "but we must never actively promote them." One particular manuscript on the official list was marked with a strange, specific instruction: to be sequestered, not formally incinerated. No one definitively knows what its contents truly were, only that it was written using red and black pigmented ink in Ge'ez and originated from a monastery near Lake Tana. The manuscript completely disappeared after being shipped to Rome in the year 1911. Its last officially recorded location was a locked, sealed case in the vast north wing of the Vatican archive. That case remains in its spot today. Its contents are officially unknown. Although the official registry of forbidden texts was formally dissolved in the year 1966, the established practice of quiet, discreet removal did not cease. It simply adopted a new, subtler form. And somewhere in that profound shadow between recorded historical memory and institutional doctrine, the list quietly persists, no longer physically transcribed by hand, but still silently shared by those who know precisely what not to access. One of those silent messages originated not from a scholar, but from a man the Church trusted with a radically different kind of deep secret. A Vatican-certified priest trained in exorcism named Father Leon Borgia. For the majority of his quiet professional life, he served in the remote outer provinces of southern Italy. He was known for his calm demeanour, his extended periods of silence, and his habit of maintaining meticulous written documentation after every single ritual. Many of those specific notes were kept in personal journals, never intended for public dissemination. But in the year 1978, following a notably unusual case involving a young religious student tormented by completely unexplained visions, Father Leon inscribed a single cryptic sentence in the margin of his official notes, a single line that has since passed silently through the careful hands of archivists, historians, and more than one high-ranking Vatican official. They are not afraid of the meaning of the words, they are afraid of the script itself. It was not his initial encounter with something he could not fully rationalize. The religious student in question had claimed he was being directly spoken to, not by an audible voice, but by distinct letters, not in Latin, not in Greek, but in a flowing ancient language he had definitively never learned. Ge'ez. The young man described the clear letters forming visibly in the air when he closed his eyes in prayer. He claimed they were shimmering, not as mere mental visions, but as something tangible and currently present. He did not know what they fully communicated, only that they were persistently urging him to read something that had been left behind. At first, Father Leon dismissed the accounts as simple spiritual trauma. But during a period of intense prayer, the same exact letters began appearing in the boy's personal notebooks, drawn with complete accuracy despite him never having seen the Ge'ez alphabet. Before any official word of the disturbing incident reached Rome, 2 senior officials arrived quietly and immediately confiscated all the written documentation. They left without offering any official explanation. Father Leon, profoundly disturbed, requested permission to view the pages again, but was formally told they had been mistakenly misfiled. Years later, he would convey to a younger, inexperienced priest, using the identical calm tone he used for his Sunday sermons, that language possesses an inherent presence. That Ge'ez, much like certain potent prayers, is not merely a complete form of communication. It functions as a specialized container, and certain specialized containers were never meant to be opened once they were formally sealed. He firmly believed the institutional church fully grasped this principle, that the fundamental fear was not rooted in the concept of heresy, but in the power of deep memory. Ancient truths deliberately stored in ink whose inherent power was not in their explicit meaning, but in their very existence. A living, enduring script, completely unbroken for thousands of years, entirely untouched by Roman correction, still strongly pulsating like vital blood flowing through the hidden internal veins of the Church. To this very day, Father Leon's personal journals are strictly held in a private collection and are not publicly accessible, but the single note remains, meticulously written in careful Latin, placed directly beside a small drawing of 3 unfamiliar letters traced in clearly trembling hands. They are not afraid of the meaning of the words. They are afraid of the script itself. Deeply hidden within the secure underground vaults beneath the official apostolic library, there is rumoured to be a singular manuscript unlike any other, an early gospel not inscribed using common black ink, but deliberately coded in pure gold. The legendary story commences in the year 1942, during the severe unrest of a global conflict, when a small sealed crate arrived unexpectedly in Rome from a Jesuit research outpost near Gondar, Ethiopia. It was dispatched with absolutely no explanation, only a verifiable signature and a handwritten specific warning. Do not utter aloud. Inside, the simple crate was a carefully wrapped bundle made of animal skin, noticeably thick and formally secured with wax. The unique script covering its parchment pages was undeniably Ge'ez, but with one strange clear difference. The letters were entirely lined in visible gold leaf, each distinct symbol precisely edged, as though specifically intended not for mere visual reading but for a formal sacred ceremony. Scholars at the Holy See examined it under strict secrecy. One of them, a specialist linguist named Brother Neri, believed it to be a completely hidden gospel, not apocryphal, not a mere duplicate, but entirely unknown to history. In his brief personal notes, later recovered from a securely archived envelope, he named it the Voice of Enoch, hidden from the official councils. The Book of Enoch itself has always been a significant source of institutional discomfort for Rome. It speaks explicitly of angels who actively fell from grace, of dangerous knowledge knowingly given to humankind that should have permanently remained in the heavens, and of a radical new vision not strictly bound by established church tradition. While select portions of it were generally known through various ancient texts, this particular Ge'ez version was something radically different entirely. Brother Neri formally reported that the manuscript communicated through symbols, not merely common words, but multiple complex layers. The unique phrases formed clear geometric patterns. Certain specific letters, when carefully traced in a specific sequence, clearly revealed precise geometric shapes. He firmly believed it was not intended to be read literally line by line, but rather systematically deciphered like a complex puzzle. And at the absolute heart of its central message was a profound prophecy, not concerning the absolute end times, but concerning a definite return. A mysterious figure named the One Before Doctrine, who would explicitly speak not in Latin, but in a long-forgotten language to a populace who had never previously heard his name. Shortly after this detailed report was officially submitted, Brother Neri promptly left his post. The official narrative claimed severe illness, though no verifiable record of hospitalization currently exists. His final recorded entry, hurriedly written in pencil inside a personal prayer book, simply read, "Some Gospels are not simply missing, they are actively waiting. The gold-coded manuscript has never been publicly exhibited. Its location, if it still resides within Rome, is currently unknown. Some theorize it was moved to a secret, hidden annex located beneath the papal private apartments. Others claim it was formally sent to a remote monastery in southern Italy under permanent lockdown and silent, constant surveillance. What genuinely concerns historians is not the manuscript's inherent message, but the radical reaction it immediately caused. Unlike all other controversial texts, this one was not officially denied, nor was it formally dismissed. It was immediately sealed away, not because of a fear of outright fraud, but out of something older, more deeply primitive, profound respect, or perhaps intense dread. For if the words of Enoch were genuinely inscribed in pure gold, it was not intended for simple ornamentation. It was a definitive warning to all those who dared to read the light in the traditional language of shadows. In the initial months of 1954, a completely sealed envelope arrived at the Jesuit operational headquarters in northern Ethiopia. It carried the official crest of the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, the most powerful Jesuit in the entire world, and it was strictly not marked for any translation, any discussion, or any official preservation. The document contained a singular declaration set in Latin and reproduced 3 times upon the sheet. It dictated the immediate return of all Gaia's texts. This was not merely a petition, it was a command. During that period, the Jesuit establishment in Ethiopia had been secretly gathering ancient handwritten books from isolated monastic settlements. Some were meticulously copied, others were acquired directly. The stated purpose was the safeguarding of important cultural writings. Yet beneath that surface objective lay a deeper, more urgent concern. Rome desperately sought to ascertain what had survived. Father Thomas, a young Jesuit cleric, was assigned to this mission. He was fluent in Ge'ez, having spent years establishing rapport with the monks in Axum, Lalibela and Tana. An aged abbot, one of those trusted, permitted him to view a collection of manuscripts stored in a sealed clay chamber, scrolls untouched for generations. Among them, he found a peculiar stack of detached vellum pages. They featured no labels, no introductions, only dense handwritten lines and enigmatic symbols. Father Thomas became convinced these were portions of a gospel never encountered in Europe. The tone of the writing was gentle yet absolute, filled with teachings and parables, many of which had no counterpart in existing scripture. One section read, "He who knows the name of God shall not speak it, but carry it in silence." Another described the tree of life, not as a garden fixture in Eden, but as a perpetual living thread throughout all human generations. He meticulously duplicated the pages, sending a select few back to Rome via diplomatic channels. Then the message arrived. There was no clarification, no context, only the ultimatum. Return everything. Do not translate. Do not discuss what you have found. When Father Thomas dared to challenge this instruction, he was swiftly removed from the mission within days. He returned to Europe in secrecy, his research notes seized at the port. He later confided in a friend that the most puzzling reaction was not the Vatican's, but the monks. They displayed no surprise. The same abbot who had revealed the scrolls to him simply smiled and remarked, "They always ask for the words, they never ask for their meaning." The official correspondence from the Jesuit superior has never been publicly released, yet copies are held in private collections. Its language is cold, precise and demanding. It stands as one of the few tangible proofs that something was discovered and that it inspired fear. Not because it directly contradicted the Church, but because it contained a memory the Church had lost. And somewhere in the obscurity, between the documents that were retrieved and those that were kept, a question persists, fluttering like a candle flame. What was Rome terrified of reading? The resolution might reside not in a single document, but in the space separating 2 distinct worlds, one anchored in the ancient stone churches of Ethiopia, and the other residing beneath the marble domes of Rome. For centuries, the Vatican and the Ethiopian Church existed like distant relatives in the Christian family, using the same names but following diverging traditions. As time progressed, these distinct rhythms began to conflict. At the core of this silent division was not just conflict or doctrine, but a question of identity, and the quiet dread that an older truth still survived beyond Rome's walls. In 1962, During the planning stages for the Second Vatican Council, hushed efforts were made to re-establish a conversation with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Superficially, the objective was unification. Beneath the surface lay a much more guarded intention. A confidential memo circulating within the council chambers mentioned the need to preserve delicate traditions in the East, specifically those maintained outside canonical supervision. That phrase, outside canonical supervision, was a euphemism. It referred to texts, beliefs, and practices that had never been influenced by Roman jurisdiction. These included complete Ge'ez Gospels, the Book of Enoch in its full rendition, and ancient hymns that referenced angelic beings not acknowledged in Latin scripture. Bishop Alphonse Maillard, one of the council's theological consultants, spoke cautiously of a stream of Christianity that may never have passed through Peter. He was referring to the Ethiopian assertion that its church was founded not through Rome, but through the Solomonic royal lineage and a direct interaction with the earliest teachings of Christ. For the Vatican, this presented a delicate dilemma. It was not heresy in the conventional sense. There were no blasphemies or denials of Christ. Instead, there was autonomy. And in the quiet corridors of authority, that was considerably more threatening. An attempt was made to incorporate certain Ethiopian texts into the main body of Scripture, granting them Roman approval. However, the Ethiopian clergy refused. A monk from Axum was noted to have said, "We do not need permission to remember." From that moment onward, the dynamic changed. Collaboration was replaced by apprehension. Shared prayers became cautious silence. A link, once carefully constructed, was abandoned incomplete, its essential blocks removed before anyone could traverse it. Though the disagreement never escalated into open warfare, its shadow expanded. Requests to borrow Ge'ez manuscripts were denied. Jesuit missions were quietly reduced in scope. The Vatican's pursuit of Ethiopian relics continued, but always through clandestine channels and unidentified agents. The result was not a confrontation, but a prolonged impasse between a faith rooted in the African highlands and one that claimed to possess the celestial keys. Each observed the other silently, like paired celestial bodies drifting apart in the same night sky. And between them, still glowing, was one unaddressed truth. What if the most ancient gospel had never required Rome's blessing at all? In the spring of 1937, 3 Jesuit missionaries were dispatched from the Vatican to the northern city of Axum. Officially, their task was to aid in the restoration of a cathedral damaged during a regional conflict. Unofficially, their true assignment was far more secretive: to locate and document a rumoured repository of Ge'ez manuscripts, supposedly guarded by the monks near the Chapel of St. Mary of Zion, the site many Ethiopians believe houses the Ark of the Covenant itself. The men were Father Augustine de Vico, Brother Paolo Sarno, and Father Matthias Kroll. All 3 possessed extensive training in ancient languages and theological history. They carried no weapons, only letters of introduction from the Apostolic Nuncio and a small locked container of supplies. Their journey led them across the Ethiopian highlands, over ochre cliffs and winding routes until they reached the hallowed city where the murmur of prayer was ceaseless. For a time they were welcomed. The Axum monks provided food and shelter, though they maintained a guarded distance from outsiders. The 3 priests worked discreetly, analysing carved writings on the cathedral walls and recording chants sung in Ge'ez. As their stay prolonged, however, rumours began to circulate. Local guides whispered that the missionaries were not there for reconstruction, but to transport something back to Rome, something concealed beneath the chapel's foundation. According to an Ethiopian report written years later, Father Augse became consumed by one particular scroll. It was said to contain an eyewitness account of the Ark's arrival, penned by a priest named Azarias, who claimed to have seen it brought into Ethiopia. The scroll was older than the concept of parchment itself. Its lettering was pale and curved like living tissue. Only the monks were permitted to view it, and even they did so rarely. One evening, the Jesuits failed to return from the chapel. Their modest camp remained untouched. Their notes, personal belongings and correspondence were left behind, including a partially written page bearing the words, "It is real." Search parties were organised. No sign of them was ever found. The Vatican requested a formal investigation but received minimal cooperation from local authorities. Months later, a sealed letter reached Rome. Written by the superior of the Axum monastery, it stated simply, "They entered the place of the Ark. None who do so without faith return." Officially, the Vatican announced the missionaries were lost due to regional instability. Unofficially, their disappearance became another incident of quiet suppression, logged, archived, and never spoken of again. Years afterward, a traveller claimed to have seen 3 names etched into the interior wall of a stone passage below the chapel. The letters were faded but recognisable. Beneath them, a concise statement written in Ge'ez, "What is taken without blessing is never found." No evidence has ever confirmed the inscription's authenticity, yet even now, locals say that when dusk falls in Axum, 3 voices can be heard on the breeze near the chapel doors, whispering prayers in a language Rome once feared to comprehend. Father Emilio Bonaschi was a young man when he first encountered those whispers. It was 1968, and he had been assigned by the Vatican to observe religious practices in the Ethiopian highlands. But he would later confess, with a quivering voice and downcast eyes, that his genuine motive was undocumented. His official papers stated he was sent to pursue a narrative that had long gone cold, the case of the 3 vanished Jesuits. By that time, the story of the Axum missionaries had faded into Vatican silence. The names remained in the archives, but the urgency had dissolved. Father Emilio, proficient in Ge'ez and known for his composure, was selected not for his academic brilliance, but for his capacity to integrate and listen discreetly. And he did exactly that. For several weeks he sat with monks in small chapels carved from stone, sharing hymns and coffee, posing carefully phrased questions when the moment felt appropriate. One evening, an old monk, blinded in one eye and hunched from years of strict fasting, beckoned Father Emilio away from the group. They walked behind the chapel as the sun dipped, painting the sky the colour of cinders. In a low voice, the monk informed him that the Jesuits had been cautioned, yet they insisted on entering a passage reserved solely for the truly devout. They acted not out of insolence but desperation. One of them had handled something that was not meant to be held. The monk refused to elaborate further. But later that night, another visitor arrived. A bishop from the nearby city, sent, Father Emilio suspected, by someone who had been watching from Rome. The following morning, Father Emilio was instructed to gather his belongings. He was ordered to return to the Vatican immediately. No written account was required. No questions would be permitted. On his departure, he tried to speak with the monk again, but the old man had vanished, absorbed, as though the earth had consumed him. Years later, long after his retirement, Father Emilio consented to a recorded interview with a small group of researchers. He was reluctant, but as the recording device crackled, his voice broke with a final admission. "They told me never to speak of it again," he said. "Not the scroll, not the passage, not their names. They said if I spoke, I would never be believed, and perhaps they were right. But I remember the scent of the chapel stone. I remember the chant in the air, and I remember what I saw etched above the entry to the sealed room." He paused, then whispered, "It was written in Ge'ez, and it said, 'Truth does not kneel.'" He never gave another recorded statement, but that declaration, shared by those who continue to explore the shadows, persists. Truth does not kneel, even when concealed. Long before grand marble cathedrals arose in Rome, before the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity, and centuries before the Church coronated kings in Europe, something ancient was already flourishing in the highlands of Ethiopia. Stone by stone, prayer by prayer. Here, in the shadow of steep precipices and red earth, the faith originated not in imperial courts or official councils, but in hidden caves and rolling hills. It was whispered from father to son, from mother to daughter, in a language no empire could claim ownership of. This was Christ before Constantine, a belief untouched by Roman military might or Latin manuscripts. In the town of Adulis, near the Red Sea, early Christian merchants and travellers brought with them more than commerce. They brought accounts of a man from Nazareth, of healing and illumination, of crucifixion and resurrection. And the inhabitants listened. Some accounts suggest the message first arrived by sea. Others believe it came through divine revelation. Regardless, by the 2nd century, Christian communities had already been established in the Ethiopian highlands. These early devotees inscribed their faith into the very bedrock beneath them. Churches were not constructed, they were unveiled, carved downward into the earth, concealed from invaders and the passage of time. Some still stand today, cool and dim, their altars worn smooth by centuries of devoted, silent worship. These places contain no elaborate murals of Roman saints. There are no stained glass windows or Latin words inscribed here. Instead, symbols older than any established doctrine cover the walls. Prayers rise in Ge'ez, an ancient, unwavering and consistent language. A major difference between this early form of Christianity and the Roman version was its deep adherence to the Hebrew origins of the faith. In Ethiopia, Jesus was understood not as a defiant figure against Jewish law, but as the living completion of it. The Ark of the Covenant, believed to be housed in Axum, was seen as a physical object, not just a metaphor. The link to King Solomon's lineage was one of actual blood, not merely poetry. In 330 AD, King Azana of Axum declared Christianity the state religion. This was nearly a generation before the famous conversion of Constantine. Rome was still debating official dogma, still separating scripture from myth, while in Ethiopia, hymns were already echoing inside windowless stone chapels. For the Vatican, this was a puzzle, a Christianity that never passed through St. Peter, a church with no need for a pope, and a gospel preserved in a tongue they could not fully decipher. Within that puzzle was a more profound realization. The faith did not begin in Europe, nor was it born in Rome's authoritative halls. It started in the deserts, in private whispers, in places history may forget, but truth does not. The question then becomes, if Christ's memory and words travelled among the hills of Ethiopia, who truly was the first to kneel? Or, as the Gaze scribes once suggested, the first altar is the heart that remembers on its own. Those words, etched onto parchment over a millennium ago, speak of something more ancient than any church bell in Rome, a memory held less in stone or official text, and more in symbols. None is more enduring than the cross. In the Ethiopian highlands, crosses exist that predate empires, councils, and even the walls of the Vatican itself. They are not crafted from gold, they do not gleam behind protective glass. They are carved into rock, etched into thresholds, made smooth by centuries of hands tracing their shape in silent devotion. Some of the oldest known crosses in the world are discovered not in European catacombs, but in the Ethiopian soil at the ruins of Yeha and the old stones of Lalibela. There the cross appears not as a representation of death, but of life, flourishing, branching out, radiant like a star. And unlike the long, straight Roman cross, many Ethiopian versions are circular at the centre, seeming to embrace eternity rather than finality. A story is passed down in Lalibela, where churches are excavated downward into the earth, resembling holy incisions. The tale speaks of a young man who saw angels in a dream showing him patterns in the sky. These forms, stars, spirals and crosses, glowed with red and gold light. When he woke, he drew them in the dirt. Those shapes, they say, became the first Ge'ez crosses, born not from Roman artistry, but from a heavenly vision. Archaeologists have dated some of the crosses in the Tigray region back to the 3rd or 4th century. This places them among the earliest Christian symbols in human history, potentially rivaling or even preceding those found in the Eastern Roman Empire, yet the Vatican seldom acknowledges them. Official papers rarely mention these symbols. Pilgrimages are not encouraged, and some scholars suspect this silence is not an oversight, but a deep unease. One specific cross is especially notable. It is carved into the foundation of a stone slab buried beneath the Church of St. Mary of Zion. Unlike most Ethiopian crosses, this one contains engravings in both Ge'ez and Hebrew. At its centre, a single line is cut with such fine detail that it can only be read in the light of dawn. From the mountain to the garden, he passed without sound. Its precise meaning remains unknown, but those who have seen it agree on one point. It is not Roman. It predates all known Catholic architecture, and it remains there, undisturbed, silent beneath the earth. The cross has traditionally symbolised suffering and sacrifice, but here in the country where the language of angels is said to linger in stone, the cross represents something else entirely. It is not a weapon, not a warning, but a memory, carved by hands the Vatican neither trained nor fully understood. In the quiet, rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, that memory has been guarded not only by monks or writings, but by blood. The stone there is red, they say, not just from the iron in the soil, but from the lives given to protect what was written in Ge'ez and kept secret from Rome. The 12th century saw the reign of King Lalibela, a leader who believed he was chosen by God to establish a new Jerusalem in Africa. In a vision, he claimed to see angels shaping sanctuaries from the living rock, not constructing them upward, but carving them into the ground, as if shielding the sacred from the avarice of men. Within 20 years, 11 monolithic churches were freed from the earth, linked by tunnels, trenches, and hidden passages. But soon after their completion, rumours began to circulate about ancient scrolls kept inside, Gospels, and even a book said to hold the original words of Enoch, untouched by Greek or Latin translation. When foreign clergy and representatives visited the site, they marvelled at the architecture, but were not granted access to the libraries. That privilege was reserved only for those who had been initiated, not just with water, but with fire. The fire came when a group of crusading emissaries, supposedly acting under European influence, tried to seize one of the holy texts from the Church of St. George. The monks resisted. They secured the entrances, lit candles, and chanted until the flames appeared. They were actual flames, started not by attackers but from within. A fire began in one of the lower chambers, and instead of escaping, 5 monks remained to protect the vault. None of them survived. The manuscript, though singed at its edges, remained intact. To this day, their names are absent from any Vatican record, yet in Lalibela they are known as the preservers of the word. Every year, on the fire's anniversary, the priests descend into the chamber and light candles in silence. No words are spoken, only the sound of water dripping from the stone ceiling like the echo of ancient mourning. A pilgrim who witnessed the ritual once wrote, "I came seeking history. I left with a secret I could never name." The fire was not only of wood, it was of conviction. What unsettled the church was not just the existence of these martyrs, but the message they conveyed, a belief that the sacred could be safeguarded without Rome, that the gospel, if true, required no official endorsement to endure. And in the darkness where rock meets ash, their memory persists not in books or sermons, but in the silence of stone that once burned, and still holds a faint warmth. There are locations in the Ethiopian highlands where time seems to stand still, soft and sacred, cut deep beneath the surface. These are the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, not built from separate pieces, but released from the mountain like sculptures hidden within a block of marble. The locals suggest they were not created by human hands alone. According to tradition, angels laboured alongside King Lalibela's masons, completing what human effort could not. By day, men chiselled and transported materials. By night, the sound of chisels continued, though no one alive was holding them. When morning arrived, new corners had been shaped, ceilings smoothed, altars hollowed out with perfect symmetry. At the centre of them all stood Beit Georgius, the Church of St. George, shaped like a cross sunk into the earth, visible only from above, as if intended for celestial eyes. It was not merely the artistry that drew attention, but the intent. These churches were not raised to be seen, but concealed. Unlike the cathedrals of Europe, with their soaring spires and gilded domes, the churches of Lalibela vanish into the ground, their roofs level with the surrounding land. They are protected from time, from weather, and perhaps most crucially, from invaders. Inside their walls, illuminated only by slender rays of sunlight, the air is motionless, the stone is cold, and the chants are age-old. Hidden within some of the chapels are narrow alcoves carved into the walls, often no larger than a folded blanket. In them lie scrolls, some wrapped in fabric, others buried under dust and silence. Most are written in Ge'ez. A few hold symbols no scholar has yet deciphered. One French archaeologist, visiting in the 1970s under the pretense of a cultural exchange, claimed to have viewed a text unlike any in the familiar biblical canon. It described a voyage across the stars of spiritual observers who fell not from rebellion but from sorrow. The pages, he wrote, glimmered faintly under the light of an oil lamp, not due to decoration, but from the ink itself, which seemed to pulse like blood vessels in the paper. He was asked to leave the next morning. No reason was given, no subsequent invitation was extended. To this day, many of those chambers remain sealed. The priests who guard them say they do so not to hoard knowledge, but to safeguard it. What is sacred, one monk told a visitor, must be kept where light cannot blind it. Rome has never asserted ownership over these churches. They exist outside papal jurisdiction, beyond canonical tradition. But within their confines, stories persist of a faith born in obscurity, carved in secret, and so deeply embedded in the earth that even time has struggled to erase it. And above every doorway, a cross is carved, not ascending, but descending, as if the heavens were never above but beneath our feet, waiting to be recognized. In the history of Christianity, Rome often presents itself as the core, the starting and ending point of all spiritual threads. But in Ethiopia, there is a silent challenge to that narrative, a sacred continuity that extends back through centuries, untouched by popes, councils, or Latin decrees. It is an unbroken lineage, a living Christianity separate from Rome. Unlike the Western Church, where dogma was shaped through lengthy arguments and imperial approval, the Ethiopian Church developed in isolation, like a tree rooted in volcanic soil. Its clergy did not speak Latin. Its worship did not follow the Roman calendar. Its sacred writings were not copied in scriptoriums, but sung from memory and etched in Ge'ez onto goatskin parchment by the glow of candles. When Christianity was made the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the Vatican began defining what would become known as orthodoxy. Councils convened, creeds were formulated, certain texts were canonized. Others were discarded. But in Ethiopia, none of that carried authority. There were no envoys from Rome, no imperial mandates. What they had received, they kept. What they remembered, they protected. This resulted in two versions of the faith that appeared similar on the surface but diverged in deep, fundamental ways. Where Rome focused on hierarchy and authority, Ethiopia placed its faith in preservation and lineage, a line of priests tracing back not to Peter but to Zadok, the high priest of King Solomon. In the 16th century, when Catholic missionaries first arrived in Ethiopia, They were shocked to find communities already worshipping Christ. They had expected to encounter pagans. Instead, they discovered ancient hymns, communion rites, and holy books they had never seen. One missionary, writing back to the Vatican, observed, "They possess the gospel, yet not our gospel. They name the Lord, but not in the manner we taught." That distinction was critical. It was more than a theological disagreement. It was a subtle threat. If a faith could survive for over 1,000 years without Rome, what did that imply about Rome's necessity? Attempts were made to bring the Ethiopian church under papal control. Political alliances were offered and translators were sent. Some local rulers, swayed by the promise of military assistance, agreed, but the general populace did not. The faith in the highlands remained resolute, and every time Rome believed it had established a presence, it dissolved like mist at sunrise. Today, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church endures as one of the oldest continuous expressions of Christianity on earth. Unbroken, unyielding, and largely unrecognized by the West. And still in the mountains where the rock churches rest, the priests chant the same words their ancestors whispered by torchlight. Words the Vatican never authorized. Words it never needed to, because the truth, when protected by memory, does not vanish. It persists quietly, faithfully, without permission. And somewhere in the shadows of those quiet traditions, there lies a gospel older than the Vatican itself. A gospel not composed in Rome, not validated with an imperial seal, and not derived from councils gathered beneath painted ceilings. This gospel was carved by hand onto parchment centuries before St. Peter's Basilica was even conceived. It was sung in Ge'ez under starry skies, passed from elder to novice, kept alive by recollection and breath. Scholars refer to it as the Garima Gospels, the oldest known illustrated Christian manuscript still in existence, created not in Europe but in Ethiopia. According to tradition, they were written by a monk named Abba Garima, who arrived in the Aksumite Empire sometime in the 5th century. Some even suggest he arrived earlier in the 4th. Regardless, what he left behind was something Rome could not account for. Pages that predate most Western biblical texts, perfectly preserved, untouched by Western translation or revision. When experts finally examined the Garima Gospels in the late 20th century, they were astonished. Carbon dating yielded a remarkable discovery. These books may have been copied as early as the year 330, possibly even sooner. That would mean they existed during the lifetime of Emperor Constantine, or before the Vatican became the Vatican. This revelation was quietly noted, filed away in academic journals, but rarely mentioned in standard church history. Because if the oldest gospel was not Roman, not even Latin, what did that say about the entire narrative upon which the Vatican had built its power? One of the most intriguing aspects of the Garima Gospels is their distinct feeling. The illustrations are vivid, full of life and colour, with no attempt to imitate Greco-Roman styles. The text is assured, fluid, filled with Ge'ez characters shaped by weathered fingers and sacred devotion. Some pages feature geometric borders that resemble the patterns found in the stone churches of Lalibela, as if the same individuals carved both word and wall. And yet, despite their age, these Gospels were largely unknown to the world until recently, hidden in the monastery of Abba Garima, protected by generations of monks who believed not in publicity but in faith. They were not for exhibition, they were for reverence. When asked why the manuscripts were never shared, one elder simply replied, "The word was given to us. It is not ours to offer for argument. It is ours to protect." There are whispers that other texts lie hidden in those mountains, even older ones, written on leather, sealed in clay, spoken only during prayer. But those who know will not disclose, and those who inquire are politely turned away, because some truths do not demand attention. They wait, older than empires, deeper than doctrine, holding their breath beneath the soil of forgotten kingdoms. In the vast halls of the Vatican Library, where the air carries the faint scent of dust and ink, there are rooms filled with texts that have never been fully read. Some are permanently sealed, others lie open but remain incomprehensible. Among them are volumes written in Ge'ez, bound in ancient leather, their pages thick with age. These are the books the popes could not translate. For centuries, Ge'ez remained a mystery to much of the Western world. It was unlike Latin, with its rigid structure and stark commands. Nor was it like Greek, flowing and rhetorical. Ge'ez moved like a chant. It felt truly ancient, not just in its script, but in its very presence, as if it remembered events too old for standard language. In the 16th century, Pope Gregory III ordered a review of all known biblical texts outside Europe. He had hoped to validate the universal authority of the Roman Church by studying foreign scriptures. A small team of scholars was sent to examine a collection of Ge'ez manuscripts brought back by Jesuit missionaries. They worked discreetly in a locked room just beneath the library's marble arches, but the project soon stalled. One translator became gravely ill and never recovered. Another abruptly left his post, leaving behind a note that simply read, "The words shift when you are not looking." Some believed the language was too intricate. Others whispered that the content itself was the issue, that what lay within those pages did not correspond to the Gospels Rome had canonized. One document preserved in the Vatican's restricted catalogue was said to contain an alternate version of the Beatitudes. Instead of "Blessed are the meek," it read, "Blessed are the silent, for they guard the voice of God." A minor alteration perhaps, but in religious doctrine, even a single sentence can reshape centuries of belief. The popes did not release a public statement. Instead, the manuscripts were returned to storage, sealed with red wax and classified under archival review pending. But they were never reviewed again. Decades later, when scholars requested access to these texts, they were informed the catalogue numbers no longer existed. And when one researcher presented a photograph of a Ge'ez manuscript stored in the Vatican archive, the librarian's face visibly paled. He took the photo, asked the visitor to wait, and never returned. Even today, the Vatican maintains a careful silence about its Ge'ez collection. Officially, it is not concealed, only awaiting reclassification. But those familiar with the Church's patterns know what that truly means. Some languages are not forgotten. They are interred, not because they are obsolete, but because what they convey cannot be controlled, only heard. And the Vatican, for all its libraries and records, has never truly learned how to listen to a voice that refuses to submit. That silence became more pronounced during one of the most pivotal meetings in the Church's history, the Council of Trent. Held over nearly 2 decades, from 1545 to 1563, this assembly was intended to settle theological matters once and for all. It was Rome's definitive response to the Reformation, a firm declaration of what was truth, what was error, and what would be officially preserved. The council debated everything from the nature of salvation to which books belonged in the official Bible. Latin was confirmed as the sacred language of Scripture, and any text outside its authority was deemed questionable. Yet nowhere in any of the public records or written decrees is Ge'ez mentioned. Not once. And yet, by that time, the Church was fully aware of its existence. Jesuit missionaries had returned from Ethiopia decades earlier with reports of ancient Christian communities, complete with their own gospel texts written in a script that had never passed through Roman oversight. Some of those manuscripts had already found their way into the Vatican's private collections. They were stored, labelled, and studied in secret. But at the Council of Trent, they were not presented. Some historians believe this omission was deliberate. To acknowledge the Ge'ez texts, especially those that deviated from the Latin canon, would have raised unsettling questions. Were the Ethiopians heretics? Or worse, were they the guardians of something older, something Rome could not claim ownership of? Behind the magnificent marble halls where bishops debated and cardinals drafted their declarations, quiet directives were exchanged. One letter found in a Jesuit archive states, Do not introduce the Ethiopian matter unless directly asked, and if asked, affirm the irregularity of their liturgy. In essence, deny their legitimacy without having to explain the reason. The Council of Trent would go on to establish the official list of sacred texts, solidifying what the Church termed the true Bible. Anything that did not conform, including entire Gospels preserved in Ge'ez, was left outside that boundary, not denounced, not discussed, simply excluded. And in that exclusion lies a deeper silence, because to leave something out without justification is more dangerous than arguing against it. It suggests fear not of mistake, but of what cannot be explained. Years later, one papal scholar confessed in his diary that during the council, a small group of clerics had privately reviewed portions of the Garima Gospels. His note was concise, almost hidden between pages, but the final line spoke volumes. "We did not speak of it. We dared not." In a council where nearly every theological point was defined and defended, the absence of Ethiopia's voice is more telling than any decree. Not all silence implies peace. Sometimes it is the sound of something suppressed, too old to obliterate, too dangerous to admit. And nothing unsettles an institution built on control more than a gospel that survived without its sanction. There are tales whispered among Ethiopian priests of a sacred book never sanctioned by Rome. It was not copied in European scriptoria. It was not weighed by church councils or debated by bishops. It simply persisted outside the Vatican's attention, yet burned with the same divine intensity. A gospel without Rome's blessing. This gospel is said to contain verses that parallel those of the 4 canonical gospels, but with noticeable variations. Where the Latin text speaks of submission, the Ge'ez version speaks of clarity. Where Rome's translation emphasizes sin and atonement, the Ethiopian lines whisper of insight and radiance, as if Christ's teachings were less about adherence and more about profound recollection. One passage found in a scroll safeguarded in the highlands of Tembian reads, "The kingdom is not made by hands, nor governed by law, but revealed in the stillness of the heart that remembers him." It is not heresy, not precisely, but it is not what the Vatican chose to sanctify, and that difference is sufficient to make it a threat. In the early 1700s, a French Jesuit visiting Ethiopia reportedly acquired a copy of this gospel. He returned to Rome with it concealed inside his cloak, wrapped in wool and secured with a leather cord. What followed was not officially recorded, but fragments of his diary survive. In it, he wrote, "The pages are ancient, yet not fragile. The words are alive. I fear the Church will not welcome what they disclose." The manuscript disappeared shortly after his return. Some believe it was locked away in the Vatican's secret archive. Others claim it was destroyed, burned before it could raise questions the Church was unprepared to address. But the Gospel itself may not be entirely lost. Copies, or perhaps variants of it, are still protected by a few monastic orders deep in the mountains, guarded not by chains, but by silence. And the Vatican is aware. It has known for centuries that other Gospels exist, written in ancient languages, bearing truths that bypass Roman interpretation. That is why, when scholars request access to certain Ge'ez texts, they are often met with vague postponements, missing catalogue numbers, or polite refusals. Not because the Church doubts their origin, but because it fears their independence. A gospel that survives without papal approval threatens more than mere doctrine. It threatens the notion that the Church must be the sole spokesperson for God, that without its sanction, truth cannot be known. But some truths were never meant to be authorized. They were only meant to be recalled. And sometimes the memory of a voice is more potent than the voice itself. The Vatican understood this all too well. As the centuries passed and the Church's influence grew stronger, so did its apprehension of what lay outside its grasp. This fear was not overt or loud. It crept in gradually, like incense filling a sanctuary. It was the development of doctrinal fear. The Church had always claimed to be the exclusive interpreter of divine truth, but with every finding of an unfamiliar text, every rumour of an older gospel, that claim fractured just a little more, not because the newly discovered challenged the old, but because the old turned out to be not quite what they said it was. By the time the Index Librorum Prohibitorum was expanded in the late 16th century, hundreds of texts were already slated for suppression. But it was not only books filled with sacrilege or dissent that were locked away. Even quiet, lyrical writings from distant lands, including Ethiopia, were included, sometimes without translation, simply because their source alone made them suspect. Gaya's manuscripts were among them. One such text, brought to Rome in the early 1700s, contained a passage that troubled the theologians assigned to review it. It described Christ smiling at the blind, not healing them, but assuring them they were already complete. The message was gentle, but it did not align with Rome's insistence on miraculous proofs of divinity. It placed the emphasis not on divine intervention, but on internal serenity, a truth residing within, not bestowed from above. That concept frightened them. If salvation could be understood without sacraments, without hierarchy, without Rome, then what exactly was the Church's purpose? Rather than confront such questions, the Vatican chose silence. The manuscript was catalogued, no critique was published. The involved theologians were reassigned, and the document disappeared from the index 3 years later, as if it had never existed at all. Fear, once ingrained in a system, does not need to be loud. It simply guides all choices. What to publish, what to hide, what to deny ever happened. It becomes routine, then official policy, then hallowed tradition. And over time, the believers forget what they were never permitted to see in private. Some clergy acknowledged the weight of this secrecy. One cardinal, in a letter he never mailed, wrote, "We fear what we do not possess, and in that fear we choose to be blind." But blindness comes at a cost, because while Rome strove to protect its authority, it also buried its own heritage, the older branches of the faith that grew without its permission but not without light. Deep beneath the vaulted ceilings and marble statues, those branches continue to move quietly, stubbornly, reminding us that doctrine, however meticulously constructed, is only as strong as the truths it chooses not to fear. It is here, beneath those very floors, that the Vatican's most guarded secret lies. The private archive known officially as the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. It is not a library in the conventional sense. It is a secure vault. A silence held behind 3 distinct locks, each one older than most modern nations. The entrance is unassuming. No sign, no grand display, just a thick wooden door behind the colonnade of the Apostolic Palace. Few are permitted entry, even fewer know what resides within. There are shelves stacked with scrolls, ledgers and letters sealed with wax. Some documents date back over 1,000 years, treaties between rulers, records of excommunications, the trial transcript of Galileo. But concealed among these well-known historical artifacts are items with no public catalogue number, items written in Ge'ez. One former archivist, who retired from his post in 1972, described the inner chamber in a rare interview. "There were drawers," he said softly, "with no names, only numbers. And among them I found a parchment, thick, darkened by time. It was in a language I could not read, but stamped on the corner was the Vatican seal, and beneath it a note in Latin. It read, 'Do not translate.'" He was never shown that document again. It is rumoured that the archive holds a complete copy of the Book of Enoch, not the fragmented versions known today, but one whole and intact, preserved in its original Ge'ez. This version, if authentic, may contain content never seen in any Western edition. Visions, names, warnings. Why such a text would be locked away is not difficult to surmise. The Book of Enoch speaks of disobedient angels, of celestial observers who fall, of truths too vast for any single religious structure to contain. It refuses to conform. It reveals a side of faith more primordial than institutional order, and for an institution founded on control, that alone is sufficient reason. 3 keys are required to open the deepest vault. 1 is held by the prefect of the archive, 1 by the Pope's personal secretary. The 3rd, some claim, is circulated among trusted officials, never kept in one place for more than a week. No single individual can unlock it alone, and so it remains sealed, not lost, not forgotten, merely hidden, like a secret that knows how to defend itself. Because behind those 3 locks may lie not just books, but the original plan of belief itself, the version that preceded the revisions, the fire, and the fear. And still it waits in the dark, behind stone, behind silence, for the day someone dares to turn the keys. But when the keys are guarded by centuries of secrecy, even the most dedicated scholars find the doors barricaded. For all its splendour and claims of accessible knowledge, the Vatican is not always welcoming to curiosity, especially not when that curiosity is directed toward what was never intended to be seen. In the early 1990s, a team of linguists from a German university submitted a formal application to access certain Gaius manuscripts rumoured to be stored in the lower chambers of the Apostolic Archive. Their goal was to compare the Ethiopian versions of apocryphal texts with the Latin ones held in public collections. They waited for months. When the response arrived, it was polite but definitive. The documents in question, they were informed, had not yet been indexed for external research. No time frame, no future date was offered, just a gentle closing of the door. The scholars did not give up. They contacted other institutions, Jesuit libraries in Rome, even monastic orders in Ethiopia, hoping to locate copies. But repeatedly they received the same answer. Those manuscripts were unavailable, not because they didn't exist, but because their public presence was inconvenient. One of the researchers, Dr. Klaus Aaron, later disclosed a disturbing incident. During a conference in Florence, he was approached by a man in clerical attire who spoke to him in fluent German. The man did not give his name, only said, "Doctor, it would be wise to let sleeping texts lie. Some words were never meant to return." Then he departed. Dr. Aaron never published his research. He left academia 2 years later. Other incidents followed. A historian from the United Kingdom researching early Christian liturgies had her travel permit to the Vatican revoked without explanation. A seminary student from Argentina studying variations in the Gospel of Thomas was dismissed from his Jesuit program after asking too many questions about Gaius texts. It became evident that access was not being denied randomly. It was deliberate, targeted. The silence was not just a matter of preservation or cataloguing, it was protection. Protection not of the documents themselves, but of the fragile boundary between official truth and forgotten memory. Inside the Vatican, the line between what is permitted to be known and what must remain buried is drawn with precision. And for those who try to cross it, the gates do not swing open, they hold fast. Because in Rome, history is not merely a record, it is a defensive wall. And sometimes the greatest danger is not what is hidden, but who still has the courage to look. One man who dared was an Italian archivist named Pietro Landi. In the autumn of 1989, he was cataloguing lesser-known texts for the Vatican Library's restricted division. Among the faded entries and unnumbered volumes, he found a brief annotation in an old codex, in Lingua Ethiopica, relocated to subterranean Vault C. He had never seen Vault C mentioned before. Intrigued, he brought the note to his supervisor. The reply was instantaneous and, without hesitation. The archive item was moved. Where exactly was it moved? Landy kept pressing, inquiring if there was any documentation of the new whereabouts. He received a reply that the log entry was outdated and the piece had likely been transferred to the records of Propaganda Fide, the Vatican branch dedicated to missionary efforts. When Landy followed up there, the personnel expressed polite bafflement. They confirmed no such item was held there. They suggested he was clearly mistaken. A week passed, and Landy's keycard access to the restricted wing was deactivated. He was moved to an alternate department, one that focused solely on administrative records from the 1800s. A subtle removal. However, Landy would later mention to a co-worker that he glimpsed something else, not in the ledger, but inside the cabinet behind the lead archivist's station. A sealed envelope marked Gaiez, Class 3. No disclosure without papal approval. He never opened that envelope. He was never given the opportunity. Landy departed the Vatican service the following spring. His identity disappeared from the official staff list. No comment was ever provided. When reached for an interview years later, he refused to speak, offering a single statement. Some truths demand a price. Others have since attempted to locate the Gez collection, but the responses are consistently identical. Vague postponements, missing inventory lists, misplaced writings. It is not that the collection was destroyed, that would mean acknowledging it. Instead, it was relocated into obscurity, moved out of easy access. It is a strategy preceding censorship. When an item cannot be destroyed, it is merely displaced. A slight modification to a record here, a missing box number there. Over time, it disappears, not through direct action, but through lapse of memory. And to those who come inquiring, the answer is always delivered with a mild, dismissive smile. That item, it was relocated. And in those few words, generations of knowledge vanish like dust through floor gaps. Because when a truth is inconvenient, the most secure lock is not made of metal. It is made of absence. And absence within the Vatican is often found where a volume should be on a shelf, or worse, in a list where a title once existed. Within the walls of the Vatican Library, there is a core inventory known simply as the Registrum Librorum. For centuries, it served as the guardian of knowledge, the main record of the collection. Every single codex, scroll and manuscript once under its protection was numbered, sorted and recorded. Until, that is, certain entries began to vanish. In the year 1967, a Jesuit academic named Father Luis Mendoza received limited access to the Registrum to cross-reference ancient Christian texts. Fluent in Latin, Greek and Gaiez, he had a specific interest in non-canonical writings preserved outside the Roman tradition. But as he began his research, he noticed an irregularity. Multiple codex numbers clearly present in older paper copies of the index were no longer available. In the most recent version, entire records had been removed, not marked as taken out, moved or limited. Simply gone, as though they had never been documented at all. One such missing artifact was known to researchers only as Codex Ethiopica 304. Father Mendoza had seen it referenced in a footnote from a Belgian missionary's journal, dated 1933. It was described as a bound set of early Christian liturgies in Gaiez, thought to contain pre-Nicene baptismal rites. But now the Vatican's own catalogue provided no record of it. When Mendoza asked the archive's assistant curator, he was met with a practiced, unemotional answer. "There is no entry for that codex," the man stated. "If it ever existed, it is no longer in our keeping." The priest pressed the subject. He presented copies of the missionary's notes. He even quoted an internal library reference code. But the reply remained the same, and 2 days later his access was withdrawn, quietly, without explanation. Years later, a former Vatican typist admitted that alternate versions of the Registrum were kept. Not duplicates, but layers. Some maintained in ink, some in carbon, others handwritten and never added to the public index. She described them as ghost lists, used to hide books the church could not ruin but would not allow to be known. Why keep such texts concealed, yet not destroy them? Because destruction attracts attention. Absence does not. And so the unlisted inventory expands, titles once familiar, now missing, manuscripts lost into legend, knowledge not erased, but silently integrated into the shadows of a system that thrives on what cannot be located. It is not censorship, not strictly. It is something older, a low sound in the catalogue, an empty space where a narrative once existed, and a silence that informs you, if you perceive it, that a significant item has been concealed. In the spring of 1938, that silence absorbed a man. His name was Brother Matteo Rinaldi. He was a quiet, thorough individual, recognised not for sermons or talks, but for the respectful manner in which he handled books, as though each one still lived. He had worked in the Vatican's archival chambers for more than 2 decades, meticulously documenting and repairing delicate manuscripts. He seldom left Rome and he rarely spoke out of turn. But one night he did something unusual. Rinaldi requested to examine a sealed codex from the Guise collection for a second time. He had seen it once before, in 1923, when it was briefly removed for upkeep. The binding was unique, sewn with copper thread and framed in what looked like gold leaf. The text was in Ge'ez, but interwoven with symbols he did not understand. He made a note of it, but followed the protocol. He never spoke of it again until that night in March. He told his fellow archivist, "There are concepts in there the Church has not yet fully grasped." He smiled when he said it, but his voice was unsteady. He was permitted to see the codex again, briefly and under observation. He failed to return to work the next morning. His workspace was empty. His personal room had been cleared, his nameplate removed. No official comment was made. No search was conducted. It was as though Brother Matteo Rinaldi had never been employed there. Years later, in a private letter sent to a Jesuit historian, a visiting diplomat from Austria recounted an odd encounter in the Apostolic Palace during the winter of that same year. While being given a tour of a restricted section of the archive, the diplomat noticed a small object tucked behind a bookshelf. A linen-covered journal, handwritten with Rinaldi's name on the inner cover. Before he could open it, the priest guiding him quickly took it away, saying only that man's work is no longer part of our record. There was no further explanation. The letter describing this incident was never made public. It was found decades later, buried in a family estate. To this day, no official account lists Rinaldi's departure. No Vatican archive mentions his resignation, nor the codex he asked for. But among a few senior archivists who still recall his name, one saying is whispered with apprehension. He saw a book they intended to keep secret, and just like the documents he worked with, he was relocated. Not in death, perhaps, but in status, filed away, forgotten, not because he violated the rules, but because he noticed the silence too clearly between the words. And in the year that followed Brother Matteo Rinaldi's disappearance, the quiet in the Vatican intensified. But it was not just a quiet of voices, it was a quiet of documents. Letters vanished, files were reduced, and one specific series of correspondence became the focus of hushed talk. The secret letters exchanged between Vatican officials and Benito Mussolini's inner circle. The year was 1939. Europe was on the brink of conflict. Italy under Mussolini was a nation full of national pride and anxiety. Yet, behind the scenes, the Vatican maintained an uncomfortable alliance with the government, a partnership framed as political necessity, but rooted in deeper arrangements. Among them were communications marked Reservato Sommo, or reserved for the highest authority, sealed not with wax, but with crimson thread, the type used only for the most sensitive church-state affairs. Decades later, a small number of these letters were found in a locked cabinet during the refurbishment of an old Jesuit residence outside Rome. The priest who found them never publicized them, but he shared a few lines with a trusted historian before turning them over to church authorities. One letter was particularly strange. It referred vaguely to Manuscripta Ethiopica, recently acquired, and cautioned that their contents may cause theological confusion if put into inappropriate academic hands. The letter concluded with an unnerving instruction: confirm their transfer to the subterranean vault before the Concordat meeting. This was not merely a concern over old documents in a foreign language. These were texts whose sheer existence presented a challenge. Because they originated from Ethiopia, a country Mussolini had recently invaded, and because they recounted narratives the Vatican had not sanctioned, researchers have long speculated about what these manuscripts contained. One idea suggests they included early Christian writings not influenced by Rome, liturgies predating the formal canon, mentions of a Jesus who taught in stories not found in the Gospels, even passages that present the Church not as a divine organisation, but as a subsequent construct of empire. Whatever they held, their removal into the Vatican's deepest vaults coincided with the growth of fascism in Italy, and with it came a new period of control, not only over people and territories, but over ideas. The Vatican, balancing spiritual beliefs and survival, appeared to tighten its grip on every word it feared might destabilise its authority, and so the letters disappeared, absorbed into the shadows, never logged, never confirmed. But among the few who saw them or claimed to, there was always a question. If the Vatican was willing to conceal truth in exchange for influence, what else did it bury during those prolonged, silent years? And what stories, bound in crimson thread, have yet to be revealed? One such story may survive not in a luxury codex or written on parchment, but in a single spool of microfilm locked away in a drawer. Most visitors will never encounter a spool without a label, a duplicate without a home. The microfilm was discovered during a standard inventory check of the Vatican's photographic section in the late 1970s. It was unmarked except for a faint number on its edge. 201. It had no name, no file number, no record of who photographed it. When it was examined through a magnifier by a technician named Elena Romani, she anticipated finding routine documents. Instead, she saw Gaye's script. Initially, she could not identify the language. She described it as ancient, geometric, and striking. The images showed pages that appeared handmade, almost glowing under the light, with unusual symbols in the margins and depictions that looked like angels without faces. The film played for precisely 7 minutes before ending in a flash of white. She reported it to her supervisor, who informed her it was likely mislabeled and would be correctly filed the following day. The microfilm spool was gone. Romani never forgot the details. Years later, she shared her story with a researcher visiting from the University of Naples. She described what she saw in careful detail. The academic believed she had viewed a fragment of a Guéhez Gospel, possibly the same missing text referenced in a Jesuit letter from the early 1900s. A version of the Book of Enoch that was rumoured to contain references to angels who rebelled against the divine order and to a saviour figure who preached not salvation, but revelation. That theory, if proven true, would undermine the foundations of Catholic doctrine, and perhaps that was the objective. What impressed Romani the most was not the content of the pages, but the form. Why would the Vatican, renowned for preserving centuries-old books in velvet-lined vaults, choose to store such a manuscript on microfilm, and only one copy? The explanation may be control. Microfilm is easily damaged. It can be concealed. And unlike a manuscript, it cannot be read by just anyone. It exists between being present and absent, a spectral version of a book, not a physical object itself. In a sense, the microfilm serves the same function as a whisper. It confirms something was once said, but leaves you uncertain of its meaning. And in the centre of the Vatican, among all its volumes, structures and customs, Perhaps nothing is more closely guarded than a truth that survives in only one format. Not to be studied, not to be shared, but simply to persist. That was the nature of the report, found decades later in a location few even knew existed, the Dead Language Division of the Vatican Archive, concealed beneath layers of security codes and stone. The division was established not for conservation, but for restriction. This was where the languages, no longer spoken and no longer permitted, were kept in isolation. The report in question was unsigned. It carried no official stamp, only a date, February 1974. Its pages were delicate, almost transparent, typed in Latin, with handwritten notes scribbled in Guez. Most academics would have overlooked it entirely, tucked between unrelated letters. But a visiting linguist from Argentina named Miguel Torrens, researching lost Coptic fragments, noticed a curious textus, non confitendus lingua animata, a text that must not be acknowledged, a language that is living. Torrens translated the report carefully, line by line. What he discovered was not a translation, but an internal warning. It referred to a scroll thought to contain pre-Christian messianic prophecy. Written in gaze, the document, it said, blurs the distinction between heavenly revelation and earthly defiance, and may lead to non-traditional interpretations of Genesis and the resurrection. One sentence chilled him. If read in the correct sequence, the symbols form a ritualistic pattern, not of devotion, but of return. The report was cautious in tone, but direct in its warning. The scroll was never to be made accessible, not to clergy, not to scholars. It was to be retained within the Dead Language Division indefinitely, with only indirect acknowledgement in official catalogues. The phrase indirect acknowledgement is rarely used in Vatican procedure. It signifies something is real, but must be treated as if it were not. That, Torrens realized, was the most effective tactic the Vatican had perfected over centuries. Not destruction, but making things invisible. When he requested further access, he was told the report had been temporarily moved. When he asked the custodian where the Dead Language Division kept such items, he was met with a look that was a mix of confusion and fear. "There is no such division," the man responded, "not officially." And yet the card on the file drawer, the one Torrens had secretly photographed, indicated otherwise. 3 words stamped in fading ink: Divisione Linguarum Mortuarum. Somewhere in the Vatican's deepest interior, past the maps, the religious objects, and the locked rooms, sits a chamber filled with voices no longer spoken aloud. Scripts no one studies, prayers no one dares to utter again. But those prayers were written once. They remain on fragile parchment behind protected shelves and in reports that end with no signature, only a final line. Let what slumbers, slumber. That final line echoed through the halls of the Apostolic Archive long after the paper that contained it had vanished. It persisted not in words, but in behaviour. The way archivists spoke softly when passing a specific corridor, the way security personnel avoided one particular turn during their nightly checks. At the core of it all was a room that was not supposed to exist, at least not in writing. In the main catalogue of the Vatican Archives, a precise record spanning centuries, there is a strange omission between a section labelled Codices Liturgici and another titled Scriptura Extra Canon. There is a gap in the numbering. Shelf 1407 is followed by 1409. One number is missing. No explanation, no note. When questioned, archivists offer a polite smile and state the catalogue was never flawless, possibly a printing mistake or a misplaced index page. But one retired assistant librarian, now residing quietly outside Milan, tells a different account. In a letter kept private until his death, he described a room secured not just by a lock, but by policy. He called it La Stanza Senza Norm, the room with no designation. He claimed to have entered it once, many years ago, while assisting with the rehousing of scrolls damaged by an earthquake. The door, he said, was unremarkable and plain, but the air inside felt different. Dry, charged, like the moment before a sudden storm. The shelves were unlike any others in the archive, not made of wood but metal, cold to the touch. The items stored there bore no labels, just symbols, small markings of coloured wax on their spines. Red, white, black. He recalled one manuscript that seemed to vibrate when held up to the light, another that had text written in reverse, readable only with a mirror, and one that appeared empty until the room was completely dark. But what remained with him most was the absolute quiet. Not just low noise, but a total lack of sound. He wrote even my breath seemed silenced. It was as if the room refused to be known. He was never asked to return to that section. No one spoke of it again. But from then on, when working late, he observed the catalogue logs would occasionally reset themselves, pages missing, entries rephrased, books gone without a record. No one ever admitted to maintaining that room, yet it was consistently cleaned, always secured, always monitored. The room with no name persists, not because the Vatican requires it, but because silence needs a haven, a place where dangerous knowledge does not disappear, but waits not to be studied, not to be destroyed, but simply not to be recalled. That was the fate of the room with no name, and possibly also the fate of the object hidden within it. An ancient map that should not exist. It was found not by an archivist, but by a cartographer named Julian Meyer, who was granted limited access to the Vatican's Historical Maps Division. In the winter of 1980, he had been studying early Christian trade routes, charting paths between Alexandria, Jerusalem and Axum, when he noticed something odd in the binding of a 16th century folio. Tucked between pages of common parchment was a thin piece of animal skin folded with extreme precision. It was smaller than the others, strangely smooth, and had markings unlike any Julian had previously encountered. At first look, it seemed to be a map of East Africa, but the boundaries were incorrect. There were no European names, no Portuguese harbours. Instead, Gaia's symbols curved across the highlands, naming towns that no longer appear on any modern map. One town in particular, outlined in gold ink, was named Zabanael. Julian could find no documentation of such a place in any religious text. Yet on the map, it was located precisely on the path of what he knew to be the ancient incense route, a path often associated with the journey of the Magi. What surprised him most was not the town, but what was marked below it, a triangular symbol drawn in red with the Latin words Domus Arxi, House of the Ark. Julian was accustomed to ancient tales. He had heard stories of Ethiopia's claim to possess the Ark of the Covenant, but never had he seen it appear on an authentic Vatican artifact. He showed the map to his supervisor, who quietly excused herself. An hour later, 2 guards escorted him out of the archive. His credentials were taken away. No reason was ever provided. Years later, in a letter to a colleague, Julian wrote it was not the map they feared, it was the location the map confirmed. If the Ark truly rested in Ethiopia, not merely as a legend, but as recognised knowledge within the guarded confines of the Vatican, then history as presented by Rome would crumble. It would suggest that divine authority, once believed to originate from St. Peter's chair, had an older parallel source, one protected by a language Rome could not translate in a land it could not conquer. The map has not been seen since. It does not show up in the catalogue. No photograph of it exists, but perhaps it was never meant to be a part of the collection. Perhaps it was meant only to be discovered once, to quietly reveal a truth, then vanish into silence, just like the place it indicated. That same low sound, a subtle challenge against the quiet, resonates through another document, long concealed and rarely discussed. It is known as the Book of Jubilees, a sacred text preserved in Gaius, untouched by the censoring pen of Vatican approval and considered by some to be an alternative Genesis. It does not begin within the beginning as the Book of Genesis does. Instead, it opens in a celestial court, where an angel speaks not only of creation, but of memory. It asserts the world's narrative was written before time itself, etched into heavenly tablets that exist beyond human understanding. According to Jubilees, every major event from the creation of Adam to the Great Flood was already recorded and documented, not by prophets, but by divine scribes. This account of the beginning is not one of disorder transitioning into structure, but one of destiny. Prearranged and precisely calculated, the book organizes history into fixed units. Jubilee spans of 49 years each, plotting time as if it were a carefully constructed blueprint. But why would the Vatican be concerned about a book like this? Because it fundamentally changes everything. The Book of Jubilees alters the narrative of the Garden of Eden. In it, Eve is not deceived, but cautioned. The serpent is not a wicked figure, but a protector of ancient knowledge, a being punished not for arrogance, but for shielding humanity from ignorance. Even the commandments appear long before Moses, inscribed by angels taught by Adam and carried through the bloodline of Enoch. In this text, the history of the chosen people does not start with Abraham, but with creation itself, connecting every human being to a sacred pattern that precedes nations, priests, or popes. That concept, whispered through centuries of Ge'ez script, undermines the fundamental authority of Rome. If law and prophecy existed prior to the Church, then the Church is not the ultimate source of truth. It is simply another interpreter of it. One Vatican scholar, writing anonymously in the early 1900s, called the Book of Jubilees a text too ancient, too comprehensive, and too honest. He added, "It reflects the Book of Genesis." But the image it shows is unflattering. The Church never officially banned the book. It did not need to. By ignoring it, by refusing to translate or distribute it, the Vatican allowed the narrative to fade away in plain sight. But the Ge'ez manuscripts continue to exist, stored in Ethiopian monasteries, passed down by hand, read by candlelight. They speak of angels who kept records, of humans who remembered, and of a beginning the Vatican could not erase, only pretend was never documented. That same quiet denial surrounds another ancient text, also preserved in Ge'ez and feared in the vaulted chambers of the Vatican. It is the Book of Enoch, and within its pages lies a vision so peculiar, so completely non-traditional, that it was discarded not because it was unimportant, but because it was too influential. In this vision, Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, is transported not merely to the heavens, but into the gatherings of angels. He does not accidentally discover secrets. He is invited, and what he observes is not splendour, but defiance. The story tells of a group of angels, watchers they are called, who descend to earth and develop affection for human women. They marry. They share hidden knowledge, astronomy, medicine, metalworking. Knowledge once considered divine is given to mortals. But what the Vatican feared most was not the transgression of the angels. It was the reason for their descent. According to the Book of Enoch, they disobeyed, not out of vanity, but out of compassion. They did not aim to overthrow heaven. They sought to assist earth. They pitied mankind's lack of knowledge and broke divine law to bring light into the darkness. These were not evil spirits. These were instructors, and for that they were condemned. The offspring of these unions, the Nephilim, were said to be giants, not just in size, but in spirit, beings who could influence nature, change weather, and speak languages lost to history. The Church dismissed them as myth, but in Ge'ez texts their names are listed, their actions recorded, their downfall lamented. What disturbed religious experts most was not the fantastical nature of the story, but the clarity of its message, that obedience does not always lead to goodness, and disobedience does not always lead to evil, that heaven itself may not be unified in purpose, and that some angels, like some men, must choose between compassion and doctrine. This threatened the entire concept of hierarchy. If divine commands could be questioned, then so could papal ones. If angels could rebel for the sake of empathy, Then what about priests who challenged injustice, saints who spoke out, reformers who were silenced? One Jesuit translator, working discreetly in the late 1800s, annotated a single Gez manuscript of the Book of Enoch on the edge of a passage describing the fall of the Watchers. He wrote they did not fall. They stepped down. The ink was later scraped away, but not before a student copied it. The Book of Enoch remains outside the Catholic canon, not because it was forgotten, but because it contained too many memories. It remembered a time when angels grieved for men, when enlightenment was passed down in secret, and when even heaven had rebels with human sensibilities. It is in that forbidden zone between myth and scripture that more names once silenced begin to stir. The names that are not spoken by Vatican officials, but have long survived in the footnotes of ancient Ge'ez manuscripts. Among them are Lilith, the giants, and the Watchers' stories the Church buried so thoroughly they hoped they would never resurface. But they did surface, and they still communicate quietly. Lilith in the Ge'ez tradition is not a malevolent figure as later legends propose, but something far older and more disruptive. She is the first woman created from the same earth as Adam, not from his rib, but his equal. And when she refused to submit, she was exiled. The Church's earliest scholars debated her existence, then completely erased her. Yet the Ge'ez texts preserved her name. She became a symbol of defiance, not toward God, but toward the social structure man established in his name. A female figure removed not because she was evil, but because she posed a threat, a structure built entirely on submission. And it was not only Lilith the Vatican feared the giants. The Nephilim returned repeatedly in these Ethiopian scrolls, not as monstrous beings, but as connections between worlds. Offspring of angels and mortals, they were said to hold knowledge too vast for a single generation. Before the flood erased them, they carved symbols into stone. They left maps of the stars and accounts of what the Watchers had taught. According to one Ge'ez account, a set of tablets created by these giants once rested in the high elevations of Ethiopia. Each tablet was said to emit a faint light at night. A Jesuit priest in the 19th century attempted to find them, but disappeared near Lake Tana. His correspondence, briefly archived in Rome, was never formally catalogued. His final note read, "Only the giants still speak, but not in our language." And constantly behind it, all the Watchers remain angels who became outcasts. Some scrolls claim they died in the flood. Others suggest they survived not as physical beings, but as gentle wind sounds, as unseen guides assisting scribes who still dared to write against the Church. These narratives were dangerous, not because they were untrue, but because they could not be managed. They belonged to no council, no dogma, no pope in GEAs. They remained strange, holy, preserved, and so the Vatican turned away, concealing not only the books but the profound questions they raised. Questions about creation, rebellion, and who truly controls the historical narrative. One manuscript in particular made that question impossible to ignore. Tucked within a worn collection of Ge'ez parchments in a monastery situated high in the Ethiopian mountains was a gospel. Not written in Latin, Greek, or Aramaic, but in the sacred Ethiopian language. It carried a name few Vatican scholars dared to utter out loud, the Gospel of Mary. Not the mother of Jesus, but Mary of Magdala, the woman the Church portrayed as a reformed sinner, a quiet follower, an unimportant detail in the history. But in this Ge'ez version, Mary was not silent. She spoke, she guided, and in some passages she instructed the apostles themselves. The Gospel began not with birth, death, or resurrection, but with a vision, a private discussion between Mary and the resurrected Christ. She asked him questions no other disciple would dare, and he replied to her with teachings the Church would later label as heresy. He told her that genuine faith was not adherence to a temple or priest, but the awakening of light within one's being, in one powerful line translated quietly by a Jesuit scholar in the early 1900s. Mary states the world cannot restrain what is inherently free. That passage was later marked out in the margin, but the ink remains faint and persistent. Rome never accepted this gospel into its canon. The reason? It positioned Mary, a woman, as the one who understood Christ most profoundly. Peter, in the same text, debates against her. He claims no woman should hold such wisdom, but the others defend her. They state the Lord loved her more than all the men, that he trusted her with the secret teachings. For centuries this gospel was known only through fragments found in Egypt and Greece, but the Ge'ez version was complete, bound in dark red leather, stored in quiet isolation, protected by monks who asserted it had been in their care since before the arrival of European missionaries. The Vatican's copy, if it exists, has never been shown, never quoted. An Ethiopian priest once claimed he saw it in Rome in a drawer labelled simply Apocrypha, Gez. He requested to see it again. The archivist told him there was no such drawer, but still the story endured, passed around the continents, a message that dared to feature a woman not as a subordinate, but as a source of authority, a voice the Church found impossible to manage, and a truth it has yet to fully suppress. That hidden fact, buried even deeper, extends beyond Mary's message and into the very narratives of Christ himself. For there are acts of wonder, quiet, strange and deeply humane that were once present in ancient Ge'ez Gospels, only to disappear when Rome began to rewrite history. These were the moments of Jesus' power that the Vatican elected to omit. In the Ge'ez writings, Jesus is shown not merely as a figure of might, but of tenderness. His miracles are not elaborate shows for the crowds, but small, private deeds that emphasize mercy more than strength. One section tells of an occasion where he restored not the body, but the memory, bringing back to an elderly shepherd the melody he had forgotten from his early years. Another details him calming a storm, not by speaking, but through complete silence, as if nature itself responded to his quietness. But it was the third miracle that most troubled Rome. In a manuscript occasionally referred to as the hidden gospel of the valley, Jesus grants sight not to a physically blind man, but to the spirit of a condemned thief. The man, sentenced to die by religious leaders, confesses his crime was not robbery, but understanding. That he had studied banned texts, writings from an era before Moses. Jesus does not pardon his actions. Instead, he kneels next to him and declares, "No, truth is returned when it is brought into the light." That solitary statement was removed from subsequent Latin translations. To suggest that comprehension itself was divine, that even forbidden knowledge could bring someone nearer to God, was to attack the very foundation of religious authority. Knowledge was intended to be filtered, never freely accessed. And so the passage vanished entirely. Other accounts were removed along with it. A story of Jesus instructing women in the marketplace while the priests raised objections. A night when he visited the burial sites of past prophets and spoke not of returning to life, but of simply recalling them. And one piece so audacious it was instantly labelled blasphemous even in private. It described Jesus laughing, not with scorn, but with pure happiness when he realised that people prayed not to him, but with one another. The Vatican's copyists substituted these with acts of power more fitting for control, changing water into wine, healing with a word of command, moving above the world rather than among it. They were demonstrations of dominance, not empathy, of divinity as a rigid structure, not a shared bond. Yet the Ge'ez texts remember. They speak of a Christ whose most profound acts were not intended to alter the world, but to teach it how to truly see. And somewhere in a chamber the public will never enter, those missing wonders remain, written in fading ink, concealed beneath layers of dust, awaiting a reader courageous enough to accept that sacredness might exist in the most minor gestures, the sort of deeds that never required Rome's blessing to be holy. That concept alone would have been enough to threaten the Church's establishment. But what came next was far more disruptive. Concealed within the Gaius documents, deep in spots rarely handled even by the most cautious scholars, were sections that mentioned a God who punished no one, and a Christ who never once spoke of a place of eternal damnation. No fire, no ceaseless suffering, no burning pools or desperate cries from the lost. Only restoration, only the chance to return. One such scroll, found in the Gondar Highlands, spoke softly of the path of smoke and light, a teaching credited to Jesus himself, recorded not by the known apostles, but by an anonymous listener. The text describes the world after death not as a final judgment, but as a collective memory, where every individual soul passes through a mist and is shown the lives it impacted, both with love and with harm. There is no suffering, only genuine self-reflection. And, beyond the mist, a gateway, always a gateway. The Vatican had no category for this possibility. Without the heavy threat of hell, fear loses its hold. And when fear disappears, obedience becomes an actual choice. That, perhaps, represented the ultimate danger. One cardinal, whose name appears just once in an archived note dated to the early 1700s, wrote, "These records, if accepted, would undo the very terror that keeps the masses in their seats." He underscored the word terror twice. In another Gaius fragment, now only preserved in a faint microfilm copy, Jesus comforts a man on his deathbed. The man weeps, convinced he has sinned too deeply to ever be forgiven. Jesus replies, "The flames people talk about are not mine. I do not ignite such fires." This statement, translated in secret by an Ethiopian nun in the mid-1960s, was never published. She was later transferred to a religious house with no available library. Stories like these were not accidentally misplaced. They were purposefully taken out. A Vatican academic once argued in a private letter never intended for circulation that these notions could not be permitted to define official doctrine because forgiveness without any consequence encourages dissent. That letter was marked "Destroy" after reading, but it was not. The Gaius texts did speak of consequence, yes, but not through instilling fear. They spoke of personal accountability, of how every soul would face not a demanding judge, but its own self, and of how, in confronting its own truth, it would elect, not be compelled, to return to the path of awareness. That kind of theological framework was completely ungovernable, and so the writings that offered no concept of hell were deliberately buried beneath layers of marble and pervasive silence. For centuries, the concept smouldered quietly, not in literal flames, but in profound questions left unanswered until this very moment. Because buried even deeper beneath that silence was something considerably more menacing. An account of the crucifixion that concluded in a surprising manner. A narrative recorded in Gaius predating any existing Latin version, with a significant twist that would completely dismantle the central element of Christian belief. In this specific scroll, excavated from a damaged monastery near Lake Tana and secretly moved to Rome in the early 1900s, the crucifixion event does not result in death. There is no spear wound to the side, no final despairing cry of being abandoned. Instead, the document describes an intense, blinding light over Golgotha. The earth shakes not from sorrow, but from a surge of powerful joy. The attending crowd scatters in sheer bewilderment. And Jesus, it states clearly, was lifted up before the world could truly destroy him. It is written plainly, in a narrative style that avoids melodrama, offering only absolute certainty. The Father would not permit the Son to be disgraced. That is the pivotal line. No tomb required, no heavy stone, no resurrection was necessary, because death simply never happened. A Vatican translator, whose personal notes were later heavily edited, commented, "This specific version does not focus on sacrifice, but on a successful escape. It utterly negates the cross, and that was the profound danger. If Jesus was not executed, then the core principle of atonement through his blood collapses completely. The fundamental doctrine of achieving salvation through shared suffering utterly dissolves." The entire structure of the church, built over centuries upon the powerful image of Christ pinned to the cross, would instantly crumble. Another passage, likely originating from the same Ge'ez source, suggests that the supposed betrayal by Judas was never truly about a payment of silver. It asserts that Judas was specifically instructed to act, not to betray his master, but rather to ensure his safety. "Go to the priests," the line instructs. "So they become convinced I am now under your control. But when the predetermined hour arrives, do not come back." It presents Judas not as a malicious traitor, but as a dedicated guardian, a faithful disciple who simply obeyed his secret command too effectively. Rome never permitted the publication of this significant scroll. It was quickly and silently sealed away inside the archive's Dead Language Division in the year 1923. The last known reference to it was in a private message between two high-ranking cardinals, one of whom wrote, "If this document ever becomes public knowledge, the symbol of the cross will permanently lose its vital power." Even today, there are quiet rumours that only 3 specific individuals have ever read the full translation in its entirety. One of them died without saying a word, one completely disappeared in Cairo. The third, his entire identity was scrubbed from all official records, his very existence now as uncertain and elusive as the controversial story itself. But if the physical scroll is proven authentic, if this version of the central crucifixion event holds even the slightest shred of historical truth, then the whole world has been reading the conclusion of the most important story ever told, starting from the incorrect chapter. And somewhere, carefully stored beneath multiple locked doors and on permanently forgotten shelves, the real ending patiently waits. Not actually lost, simply never truly read. But what if that authentic ending speaks of a Christ who genuinely never asked for any kind of institutionalized church in the first place? This concept too is recorded in Ge'ez, discovered on a heavily weathered scroll secretly smuggled out of Gondar during the early years of the 20th century and strongly rumoured to have eventually reached Rome just prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. It speaks not of elaborate altars or magnificent cathedrals, but of a devoted teacher who spent his time among humble farmers and fishermen, and who specifically instructed them not to build anything but to intently listen. In this specific version, the word church is completely absent. Instead, the sacred text repeatedly uses a distinct phrase, the gathering under sky, as if the only true temple was always the physical earth itself. And worship had no physical roof, no fixed pews, no expensive statues or gold adornments, just the natural sound of breathing and the movement of the wind and the sacred name of God quietly shared between people who felt no need to prove anything to anyone else. For the Vatican establishment, this was not just a minor heresy. It represented the complete dismantling of a core gospel message that removed the fundamental need for organised structure, eliminated all hierarchy, and even negated the entire concept of sacred buildings. What functional purpose would then remain for them? One Jesuit scholar specifically tasked with secretly evaluating the scroll's authenticity wrote in his private journal, "If this is truly accurate, then Rome is certainly not the designated centre. It never was the centre." He officially vanished in the year 1941. This specific vision of Christ, quiet, fundamentally unowned, simply wandering, threatened far more than mere dogmatic belief. It threatened absolute ownership. If true faith did not securely belong to the official church, if it thrived entirely outside its massive walls, then the Vatican's rigid hold on historical interpretation would permanently slip away. The power to definitively define, to publicly declare, to strictly forbid. All of it would gradually disappear like smoke dissipating from a recently extinguished candle. That is precisely why the scroll was instantly silenced, not because it was definitively proven false, but simply because it was dangerously free. There is a long-standing story quietly shared between archivists in the deep underground corridors of a cardinal who once attempted to bring the existence of the scroll into the open light. He was quite old, nearing the end of his natural life, and he sincerely believed the Church was finally strong enough to confront its own shadowy past. But on the specific morning of his highly anticipated official presentation, his office was completely cleared out, his private record sealed permanently, and his name was never mentioned again by anyone in authority. The scroll. It remains officially unlisted in any public catalogue, but some strongly suggest it currently rests inside a small wooden box intricately carved with traditional Ethiopian symbols, strategically placed in the third subterranean vault on the left, tucked away behind a decorative curtain that has not been disturbed since the year 1958. A Christ without any institutional church, a genuine truth without any official throne. If these crucial pages are ever truly read aloud to the world, it will certainly not occur in St. Peter's Basilica, nor under any magnificently painted dome. It will take place in the open air, surrounded by trees, beside moving water, exactly as it was originally intended to be heard. And if Christ himself consistently stood outside the established walls, then what relevance remains for the complex doctrine constructed entirely inside them? What then of the fundamental concept of the Trinity? The specific threefold name always spoken in Latin, permanently etched in marble and painted onto cathedral ceilings from Florence all the way to Rome? The Vatican officially teaches the Trinity as an ancient and completely unshakable foundation. But Gayer's scrolls, significantly older than Rome's first established canon, hint at something profoundly different. In the soft, continuously flowing letters of that sacred language, there is explicit mention of the Son, there is explicit mention of the Spirit, but the intrinsic unity between the three, Father, Son and Spirit, is deliberately described not as a fixed law but as a perpetual mystery. One isolated fragment, translated during the 1960s by a devoted monk who eventually chose to leave his religious order, reads, "They move together as light, yet they are not rigidly chained." He initially believed it was merely a beautiful, poetic metaphor. But when he attempted to present the entire scroll to his ecclesiastical superiors, he was immediately ordered to burn it entirely. Instead, he secretly mailed a precise copy to a prominent professor of Semitic languages located in Paris. That professor's private home was subsequently broken into just 2 weeks later. Absolutely nothing was stolen except for that single scroll. Gayer's theology did not outright deny the Trinity concept, but it certainly did not strictly insist upon it either. In some very early texts, the divine essence is fundamentally singular, constantly moving through various forms like flowing water, at one moment as a distinct voice, at another as gentle breath, and then as pure cleansing fire. No harsh, rigid lines, no permanent names laboriously carved in unforgiving marble. Only continuous movement. For the Vatican, that was fundamentally dangerous. Without firmly fixed labels, control inevitably slips away. And so the established doctrine became a deliberate hammer. From the major council of Nicaea all the way to the Council of Trent, any gospel document that subtly questioned the Trinity, or even simply neglected to strictly define it, was immediately marked for total removal or total silence. A specific bishop from the northern region of Ethiopia once visited Rome in the year 1924. He brought with him a cherished copy of an old Gayer's homily that spoke eloquently of the many names belonging to the one central flame. The Vatican archivist, who officially received it, made a cryptic note in the margin, too fluid, borderline pantheistic, filed under restricted review. That copy has never been seen again by anyone, but the powerful memory of it stubbornly persists. Among the numerous priests who were employed in the Vatican's specific language division during the 1940s, there was one particular man, quiet, meticulous, who once confided to a trusted colleague, "The Trinity is not what they assume it to be. In Gayer's it actively breathes." When directly asked exactly what he meant by that statement, he simply smiled faintly and replied, "It completely changes when you read it out loud. The fundamental question is not whether the Trinity has always been doctrine. The crucial question is who precisely decided it absolutely should be and their underlying reasons. Anything fundamentally different had to be permanently forgotten. In a very quiet vault situated deep beneath Rome, far removed from the dazzling marble halls and shiny gilded icons, there lies a single worn bundle carefully wrapped in simple linen. According to a detailed catalogue entry officially made in the year 1952, it is labelled simply Thomas Apocryphal. In Ge'ez, most scholars know the Gospel of Thomas through fragmentary dusty Greek pieces, or the later Coptic copy accidentally found in Nag Hammadi. But the distinct version in Ge'ez, the one secretly discovered deep within the rugged highlands of Ethiopia, is strikingly different, not only in its specific language, but profoundly in its overall tone, in its deliberate silence, in exactly what it dares to leave completely unsaid. This gospel deliberately does not tell any sequential stories. It only quietly whispers simple sayings. No traditional narrative of a birth in a stable manger, no grand miracles performed by the sea. Instead, a continuous string of powerful teachings, organized like a series of beads on a cord, each one powerfully beginning the exact same way. Jesus said, and one of them reads, "Split a piece of wood, and I am immediately there. Lift the stone, and you will instantly discover me." No required temple, no required altar, no required spiritual mediator. For a church deliberately built upon rigid hierarchy, this particular gospel was an existential threat. If God is already fully present within all things, what possible need remains for walls, for vestments, for the entire apparatus of Rome? That is the quiet path the Gospel of Thomas genuinely offers. Not a forced road to follow, but a profound stillness to willingly remember. In the Vatican archives, there is an official record of a major debate that took place in the year 1933. A scholar from the Pontifical Biblical Institute had somehow come across the Ge'ez version and formally proposed a comprehensive study. The request was instantly and completely denied. The administrative note scrawled in the margin says, "Text fundamentally undermines ecclesial authority, offers no atonement, no mandatory sacrifice, only simple awakening." One priest, a translator who had diligently worked in the Ge'ez division before it was forcefully closed down, strongly believed the gospel was deliberately removed, not because it was inherently false, but because it was dangerously too honest. He emphatically stated it leaves absolutely no room for manufactured fear, and fear, he argued, is the essential first step in ensuring complete obedience. Among Ethiopian monastic communities, this gospel was never truly hidden from sight. It was widely read late at night by soft firelight. Its verses were rhythmically chanted slowly, like a comforting lullaby. Not because it was considered dangerous heresy, but because it felt intimately close, so unsettlingly close to the very breath of the divine essence, it almost terrified them into silence. In the end, the Gospel of Thomas does not explicitly tell you what specific actions to take. It only tells you to openly look and to intently listen. Not to various priests, not to dusty scrolls, but simply to the profound silence waiting within. In the spring of the year 1965, that quiet silence was dramatically broken by the unmistakable sound of wheels making contact in Addis Ababa. It was certainly not the first time a sitting pope had turned his attention eastward. But this particular visit, quiet, purposely unannounced to the general public until just days before, felt fundamentally different. Pope Paul VI, formally draped in pure white, slowly descended the steps of the Vatican plain with a guarded, careful smile and eyes that constantly moved cautiously from deep shadow to bright light. He arrived carrying a significant gift, but far more importantly, he arrived expecting a major exchange. Behind the heavy velvet curtains of the imperial palace, Emperor Haile Selassie patiently waited. A man of deep, ancient tradition and possessing an extremely sharp intellect, he had long kept Ethiopia's historical treasures carefully guarded from the intrusive, probing eyes of Western academics. But even Selassie, the venerable ruler of a land rumoured to be older than the biblical Genesis itself, clearly understood that the global landscape was irreversibly shifting. The Vatican establishment understood that reality too. The crucial meeting was remarkably brief. No journalists were permitted inside the room, no microphones, no cameras allowed to document the proceedings. Only soft, low voices speaking over highly polished tables and 2 dedicated translators, who to this very day have never publicly spoken of what they overheard or what specific items were exchanged. Rumours continue to circulate throughout the ancient monastic communities of Lalibela and Axum even now. Some suggest the Pope personally returned an extremely ancient scroll that had been confiscated during Italy's initial occupation in the year 1936. Others strongly argue it was not a scroll at all, but a massive codex bound in significantly darkened leather. A Guiers manuscript that astonishingly spoke of a Jesus who never died but simply vanished completely into the surrounding hills. But perhaps the most unsettling rumour originated from a former librarian employed at the Vatican Apostolic Library. In the private margin of a cryptic letter written just after the Pope's return trip, he quickly scribbled a specific note, Collection 4E, moved to Subvault B per Addis. What precisely was Collection 4E? No official record fully explains its contents. But according to one highly respected retired Jesuit archivist, 4E once specifically referred to sensitive texts labelled non-Latin apocrypha, Eastern Christian heresies. Back in Addis Ababa, the Emperor's private chapel received a curious new addition. A modern case made of climate-controlled glass was permanently installed in the rear wall, and even though no official label appears anywhere on the wood, one monk quietly whispered of what precious item lies securely inside. A single page written in gold ink on dark black papyrus, a mysterious script that glows faintly under the steady oil light, a powerful passage from a gospel that was never officially canonized, speaking not about physical death, but about fundamental transformation. The Pope never publicly spoke of the trip again, and the Vatican never willingly released its detailed records. But some strongly believe what truly passed hands that day was not mere paper, not old parchment. It was mutual permission. A shared mutual silence, a complex agreement that some truly profound secrets, once exchanged, must be maintained completely hidden forever. But silence always has an unsettling way of slipping easily through tiny cracks. And sometimes what is deliberately hidden eventually decides to actively move on its own accord. In the autumn of 1966, a substantial shipment departed from Addis Ababa, officially bound for the Vatican. It was discreetly marked as liturgical materials, an innocent-sounding label carefully masking something far more historically fragile. Among the various wooden crates was one particular small box, carefully wrapped in tar-coated canvas, securely sealed with both the official Vatican seal and the prestigious crest of Ethiopia's imperial court. That specific crate never officially arrived at its final destination. The Vatican immediately claimed it was tragically lost during transit. Ethiopian records, however, stated unequivocally it was correctly handed off at the Rome airfield, somewhere in the murky space between the tarmac and the papal vaults. It completely vanished for several months. Silence, then only growing whispers. An airman specifically stationed near the Chiampino airport swore he personally saw 2 priests carefully remove the crucial crate from the main cargo bay area before any customs inspection. They then loaded it quickly into a sleek black car equipped with heavily tinted windows and immediately drove off toward the city. The vehicle registration perfectly matched one routinely utilized by the Jesuit courier service. When official investigators pressed for further details, the entire record abruptly disappeared. The missing crate quickly became a persistent rumour among the archivists, a haunting ghost story quietly traded in low voices after dark. Some suggested it contained a rare codex, one of the single oldest Ge'ez Gospels known to exist, complete with detailed annotations that challenged both fundamental Catholic and traditional Orthodox teachings. Others suggested it contained letters, private correspondence between Emperor Haile Selassie and Pope Paul VI, securely sealed under solemn oath, each promising enduring silence about something neither powerful man could ultimately destroy. In the following year, 1967, a brief internal Vatican memo secretly surfaced. It was explicitly addressed to the prefect of the library, refrain from all inquiries concerning Crate 23E. All materials presumed to be contained therein are officially classified under temporary theological review. But temporary can certainly last forever when the powerful institution of Rome actively chooses not to officially remember. One specific archivist, a young man originally from Malta, meticulously kept his own private notes. In them he described a narrow, forgotten storage room located directly beneath the Vatican Library, where the air constantly smelled heavily of damp stone. He distinctly saw empty shelves conspicuously labelled Ethiopia 1966. He also documented an unsettling detail that in the chamber directly below, designated for preservation work, he picked up faint chanting in Ge'ez. No one was meant to be occupying that space. When the man returned the next morning, the doorway had been sealed with brick. Some accounts suggest the missing container was finally located not in the Vatican, but decades later in Geneva, inside the archives of a defunct missionary group. The listed contents were simply illegible theological fragments. After the Vatican was informed, the crate was claimed, flown to Rome under diplomatic privilege, and was never sighted again. Perhaps it genuinely was just misplaced during the transfer. Or maybe its intention was never to arrive, only to vanish so that its absence could carry more weight than its writings ever would. But that stillness was not maintained for long. In the year 1973, 7 years following the crate's disappearance, a meeting occurred away from public scrutiny. It was not held in Rome or in Addis Ababa, but in Geneva, within a slim stone building that was once part of the League of Nations. Inside, under the official guise of a theological symposium, 3 Vatican envoys and 2 officials from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church convened privately. Officially, their purpose was to discuss collaboration on translation projects. Unofficially, they were there to resolve a conflict that had lasted centuries and to decide the destiny of the Ge'ez manuscripts still retained by Rome. The Ethiopian delegates carried evidence, some copied from the imperial archives, others handwritten notes from monks in Axum. Among these was a single page signed by Emperor Haile Selassie himself, bearing a date prior to his overthrow. The Vatican representatives brought something smaller, a sealed envelope labelled Confidential 3A, its wax unbroken, its contents unknown. Witnesses reported the meeting lasted nearly 9 hours. No photographs were taken. When it concluded, one of the Ethiopian priests departed visibly distressed. The Vatican officials left without addressing the press, their expressions weary and pale. A week later, the official statement characterized it as a productive theological discussion. But deep inside the Vatican archives, there is another entry, coded and partially erased, that reads Accordo Silenzioso, the silent agreement. What did its terms hold? One theory suggests the Vatican agreed to return certain manuscripts, but only those considered theologically harmless. In exchange, Ethiopia promised never to request the Ge'ez texts known as the Lost Five. These were rumoured to hold the alternative narratives of creation, the rebellion of the Watchers, and the gospel of the woman referred to as Mary of Light. Another story, passed among former archivists, claims the pact went further, that both parties consented to hide the existence of one particular codex, one that depicted the crucifixion not as a death, but as a metamorphosis. It was the same disruptive concept that had troubled the Church since the discovery of the Gaius Gospels decades prior. Years later, when Pope Paul VI was asked by a reporter about his relationship with the Ethiopian Church, he offered a slight smile and said, "Some histories are better held by both hands." That response, cryptic and intentional, may have been the sole public evidence of the silent agreement, because whatever was signed in that dim Geneva room did not vanish like the missing crate. It was buried deeper, not lost, but protected by two separate faiths who were afraid of what might occur if the world ever read what they had mutually consented to ignore. But secrets, even those intentionally safeguarded, rarely stay static. A few years following that quiet meeting in Geneva, the Vatican began a practice it had not initiated in centuries. It started to move its texts not from one location to another, but from the accessible world to the concealed one. That was when the Gaius collection was relocated underground. It commenced in the winter of 1978 under the explanation of renovation. The public reasons cited humidity control and preservation, but what followed seemed less like conservation and more like entombment. Scholars who once had free access to the Oriental Languages Division found their permits revoked. Wooden crates, unmarked except for small emblems of wings and crosses, were transported through narrow passageways by men who wore not the vestments of priests, but the uniforms of Vatican security. An older archivist named Father Leonetti, who had worked there since before the Second World War, tried to track the procession one morning. He later recounted in a letter smuggled to a colleague in Florence how the boxes were lowered by freight elevator to a basement chamber beneath the library's foundation. The chamber was excavated into volcanic rock, dry, silent, and far removed from the aroma of incense and candlelight. There, beneath lines of dim bulbs, stood iron doors numbered 1 through 7. Father Leonetti swore that when one door opened, he saw a shelf filled not with Latin texts, but with dark leather bindings, inscribed with unfamiliar lettering. Curved, elegant, and unmistakably Gaius. A guard commanded him to turn back, stating, "You are in the division without a name." Weeks later he was reassigned. His letter was intercepted. He passed away the following year. The Vatican never publicly addressed the transfer. Yet in 1980, a brief memo appeared in an internal newsletter. Oriental collection reclassified under restricted theology. Movement complete. That phrase, movement complete, became an unspoken legend among archivists. Some believed it meant the scrolls had been sealed inside a lower vault beneath St. Peter's Basilica itself. Others thought they had been split up, part staying in Rome, part sent to a secretive monastery in the Alps for protection. The most unusual detail came from a construction worker involved in the renovations. He told his son years later that while sealing off a passage near the crypts, he heard chanting, low and regular, in a language he did not recognize. He asked his supervisor about the sound. The man told him, "That is not for us to hear." Since then, the Gaius collection has disappeared from every catalogue. No scholar is permitted to request it. No inventory lists its volume or its contents. It resides beneath marble and memory, a library without light, guarded not by religious conviction, but by the fear of what might happen if its words were ever exposed to the sun again. But one individual did manage to retrieve a few of those words into the open. Her name was Sister Beatrice of the Order of St. Cecilia. She was not an academic by profession, but a linguist by spiritual dedication. She was fluent in Latin, Greek, and, unusually for her generation, Gaius. In the late 1980s, she was assigned to help catalogue older Eastern manuscripts that had recently been moved to the Vatican's Language Restoration Division. It was expected to be routine labour, quiet and mechanical. Yet one evening, while organising damaged pages, she discovered a fragment that should not have been there. It was tucked between two unrelated documents, concealed like something smuggled in. The ink was pale, almost grey, but the script was undeniably Ge'ez. At the top of the fragment was a title written in Latin, added much later by another person. Liber de Luminibus Celestis, the Book of Heavenly Lights. As she translated, she realized it was not astronomy or theology, but an actual revelation. The writing described visions experienced by an unnamed disciple who followed Christ after his resurrection. Visions of light speaking with a voice, of angels who called themselves the echoes of men, and of a world where the church was no longer necessary because the Spirit walks freely among every heart. Those words were provocative. They suggested the divine was no longer restricted to an altar or a priest, but was alive in every person who chose to listen. Sister Beatrice proceeded with the translation at night, copying sentences into her private journal by candlelight. But someone noticed. Her supervisor began to inquire why she remained after normal working hours. One morning when she arrived for work, her desk had been completely cleared. The fragment was gone. The logbook that recorded its shelf location had been replaced with a blank one. 2 weeks later, she was transferred to a convent in southern Italy. She confided in a friend, another nun named Lucia, that she was being relocated for her own peace of mind. Before she departed, she handed Lucia a folded page from her notebook. On it was a line from the translation. The word was never caged. It was only quiet until we remembered its sound. Sister Beatrice died in 1993, officially due to illness. But when her personal effects were returned to her family, the notebook was missing. Only a single piece of paper remained, tucked into her Bible. It read in her own writing, "Some truths do not need permission to be spoken." And although her translation was destroyed, portions of her notes still circulate quietly among scholars. Ghost pages from a gospel that refuses to fade, a whisper from the deep vault that had attempted to silence her. But even whispers can travel great distances when someone chooses to pay attention. In the spring of 1997, a young historian named Paolo Ferraro received an unmarked package at his apartment in Rome. Inside was a small cassette tape and a brief message written in neat sloping handwriting. The Vatican will deny this. There was no signature, no way to trace the sender. The tape was labelled only with the words Beatrice, March 1993. At first, Ferraro assumed it was a hoax, but when he started the playback, he heard the shaking voice of an elderly woman. The background noise was minimal. Only the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet click of a recorder being activated. Then she spoke. "My name is Sister Beatrice," the voice said softly. "If you are hearing this, I am already gone." Her words were slow, almost like a prayer, as she detailed her period in the Vatican's translation department, the same time when the Ge'ez manuscripts were being moved underground. She discussed the fragment she had translated, its core message that the Spirit walks freely among every heart, and how those pages disappeared after she was questioned by church authorities. But the tape did not end there. She asserted she had viewed more than just fragments. She had glimpsed a complete codex, one kept in a locked cabinet, labelled non repertum, not found. According to her testimony, the codex contained texts attributed to Thomas the Twin, depicting Jesus not as divine above men, but divine within them. The sentence she quoted on the tape, "He who finds the light within himself shall find me again, not in Rome, not in heaven, but in his own heart." Her voice trembled as she delivered the quote. "They will claim this text never existed. They will burn my notes. But I have left my truth behind. I am not afraid." Then, almost as if talking to herself, she added, "If this is the last sound I leave in the world, let it be this." The word was never theirs to keep. The recording stopped suddenly, followed by a faint noise, a door creaking open, and a muffled male voice saying, "Sorella, it is time." Then silence. Ferraro presented the tape to several journalists, but none would agree to publish the story. Within a month, his apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen except the tape. Years later, a digital duplicate surfaced online, posted anonymously, then quickly deleted within hours. Yet the written transcription persists, shared discreetly among both academics and believers. The Vatican will deny this, she had predicted, and perhaps it has, but her voice, gentle, steady and intact, still echoes a spectral confession carried through time, reminding us that truth, once voiced, does not perish. And there was another truth the Vatican could never fully suppress, one that originated not in a library, but from a distant mountain thousands of miles away. It was the assertion that the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred relic in all of Scripture, had never actually been lost. It had been protected in Ethiopia, and Rome had been aware of this for centuries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained a small chapel in the ancient city of Aksum, the Chapel of the Tablet, as they call it. Inside, no one is permitted entry except one chosen guardian monk who is permanently confined to the grounds. To the faithful, this chapel is not just a symbol. It is the residence of the true Ark, the same chest that once contained the tablets of Moses, the rod of Aaron, and the manna from heaven. In 1982, a Vatican delegation discreetly visited Addis Ababa under the cover of a cultural exchange. However, among the delegates was a man named Cardinal Vellini, known within the Curia as the Keeper of Relics. Official records claimed he was studying religious art, but local informants said his trip concluded not in the capital city, but far to the north, in Aksum. He arrived after dark, escorted by Ethiopian clergy and soldiers. No cameras, no public ceremony, only rumours that the Church of Rome had come not to donate, but to observe. For 3 hours the cardinal remained inside the chapel perimeter. When he re-emerged, his complexion was ashen, his hands visibly shaking. One witness claimed he knelt on the ground before leaving, whispering words in Latin that few understood. "It is not ours." Upon his return to Rome, Cardinal Vellini submitted a sealed document directly to the Secretariat of State. No one ever read it publicly, but 2 months later, the archives added a file titled De Arca Testamenti Confidenziale. It was instantly classified. There are rumours, faint yet persistent rumours, that what the cardinal witnessed in Aksum fundamentally altered the Vatican's perspective. Some suggest he observed a relic that emanated a visible light. Others believe he saw inscriptions in Ge'ez written along the edge of the Ark itself, declaring that its caretakers were the sons of Solomon and the children of Zion. If accurate, that would imply the Ark was not only Ethiopian, but part of the same Solomonic lineage that the Vatican had once attempted to remove from recorded history. Decades later, a retired Ethiopian priest described how a letter arrived from Rome offering security for the Ark should political instability ever endanger the chapel. The letter was unsigned. When Rome encountered the Ark, perhaps no formal agreement was made, only an understanding, a quiet recognition that the holiest object in Judeo-Christian history did not rest beneath St. Peter's dome, but in the possession of a faith that never required Rome's endorsement to guard it. Yet even as the Vatican yielded to what it could not possess, there was something else, an artifact that it did claim, though it never displayed it. It was spoken of in hushed tones among restorers and archivists as the Flesh Codex, or in quiet Latin, Liber de Spell, a book they alleged bound in human skin. The story began in the year 1989, when a team of Vatican conservators was assigned the task of cataloguing damaged manuscripts from the restricted collection. Among the crates, wrapped in waxed linen, lay a small volume. No title, no cross, no decorative gold leaf. Its covering was pale, almost translucent, like very thin parchment. On its spine, lightly burned into the surface, were the words Ge'ez Private Translation. The lead restorer, Father Mariani, later confided to a colleague that the book made him feel uneasy before he even opened it. "It felt alive," he said. When they examined the cover under lamplight, the texture did not match any animal hide. It was too smooth, too flexible. A sample was discreetly sent to the Pontifical Laboratory of Restoration. The report that was returned days later was sealed, but one technician later admitted that the material contained traces of human collagen. The Vatican never confirmed this. Officially, no such book is in its collection. But the whispers intensified. Some claimed the codex held writings translated from an unknown gaze source, a text that combined prayer with prophecy and prophecy with grave warnings. One excerpt, later leaked in fragments, described a covenant written in flesh that cannot decay. Another spoke of a witness who wrote, not with ink, but with the breath of men. These sentences terrified the priests who read them. What kind of scripture would use the human body itself as its binding? The rumour grew darker when a restorer vanished the following year, leaving behind only a single note. "It watches." His workstation was sealed off. The book was never spoken of again. A scholar decades later claimed to have seen a photograph, a blurry image of a small codex resting on red velvet. The cover marbled with faint patterns resembling veins. When asked where he saw it, he simply replied, "The archive that does not exist." No official documentation has ever appeared. But inside Vatican passageways, the account of the Flesh Codex endures, not as a fable, but as a warning. Perhaps it is merely a legend, or perhaps somewhere beneath the marble structures lies a book that remembers its authors in the most literal sense, a book whose pages still faintly whisper, and whose cover, in the dim light, almost seems to breathe. But that was not the only codex to disrupt the Vatican's innermost operations. There was a different one that neither bled nor breathed, yet somehow frightened the Church even more deeply. Archivists referred to it as the Ge'ez Codex of the Living Word, and for a short time in history it nearly saw the light of day. That moment ended in total alarm. The story begins in the spring of 1992, when a Vatican researcher named Father Emilio Santoro was given temporary access to the Oriental Division for a specialized study on early Ethiopian liturgies. According to surviving notes, he was quiet, exceptionally intelligent, and devout, a man entrusted with sensitive truths. On his third evening in the archives, he discovered a codex with no identifying catalogue number. Its binding was dusty, but in good condition. It was written entirely in Ge'ez. Yet the script seemed to glimmer faintly under the lamp, as if the letters changed position while being read. Father Emilio described it later in his personal diary. "The text moves like water. When I blink, the words are not where they were." He translated the first page and then stopped writing for 3 days. When he resumed, his handwriting was erratic. Rushed, he claimed the codex began with a message that appeared to be speaking directly to him. The word is alive, and those who read without faith awaken what should sleep. It is said he began to cry. Within a week, the Vatican terminated his research access. The formal reason given was sudden illness. But those who saw him before he left described his face as pale and drawn, his eyes vacant. One librarian swore she saw him whispering Ge'ez phrases repeatedly under his breath, as if answering a voice no one else could perceive. When his notes were collected, the codex was taken from the shelf. The guards were instructed to label the case as condemned for restoration. 2 days later, an emergency council was convened inside the Secretariat of State. No record of that conversation remains, but one internal memo reads simply, "Codex, not to be read again. Do not attempt translation." Some believe Father Emilio was sent to a monastery in Umbria, where he spent the rest of his life in seclusion. Others claim he disappeared during a routine transfer. Years later, a new archivist discovered a line scratched into the inside of a storage cabinet in the same room where the codex had been kept. The words were in Latin. The living word sleeps beneath. That night, the entire division was sealed. The Vatican called it a structural problem, a standard closure for safety. But those familiar with the story offer a different explanation. They say the panic was not about the integrity of the building, but about what might happen if the living word ever awakened again. And perhaps in a subtle way, it has. Because even in its complete silence, the Vatican cannot erase the reverberations of what it once tried to enter. Deep beneath the marble corridors, under the gaze of saints and painted ceilings, the remnants of a forgotten faith continue to stir. They are not ghosts in the supernatural sense, but memories that refuse to expire. The faint resonance of a language once believed to be spoken by angels. The subtle scent of ancient ink clinging to lost parchment. The rhythmic pulse of stories that still draw breath inside their sealed vaults. Some say that in the deepest chamber of the archives, the atmosphere feels uniquely different. It carries a stillness too profound to be mere dust. The security staff who work there at night avoid certain hallways, claiming the lights flicker even when the electrical system is stable. A few have reported hearing soft chanting in melodic patterns they do not recognize. Low, steady, and truly ancient. The same sound that was once called prayer in the high plateaus of Ethiopia. Others believe that silence itself has become the Church's final safeguard, that after centuries of burning, censoring and hiding, the Vatican finally understood that destruction only fuels curiosity. Silence, conversely, transforms secrets into ghosts. Ghosts that wander discreetly through history, entering dreams, permeating books, becoming whispers across continents. Every so often, one of those ghosts finds a way to speak. A monk in Lalibela has a dream of a scroll that glows like a flame. A linguist in Rome hears a phrase in Ge'ez she is certain she never learned, yet can translate with flawless accuracy. A tourist walking near the stone walls of St. Peter's feels a vibration beneath the pavement, like the slow turning of a hidden page. Maybe it is nothing more than fantasy. Or maybe, as the Book of Enoch once proclaimed, nothing written in light can ever truly vanish. The Vatican maintains its silence. The rooms underneath the library remain locked. The corridors beneath St. Peter's stay heavily guarded. But time, unlike marble, does not keep secrets permanently. It erodes them gently, persistently, until even the most formidable door starts to whisper. And perhaps one day, someone will hear. When that day arrives, they will not find only the Ge'ez Bible, or the hidden gospel, or the forbidden words. They will uncover something far older. The realization that faith was never meant to belong to any earthly power, that the divine cannot be owned, and that silence is merely the pause between revelations. Until then, the ghosts wait. They wait in the dim vaults of the Vatican, in the high mountains of Ethiopia, and in the quiet recesses of every heart that continues to wonder. Because faith, like language, never truly perishes. It only falls silent until someone is brave enough to utter it again. Thank you for travelling with us through the shadows of history and the faint echoes of belief long forgotten. If any of these Vatican enigmas sparked your curiosity or made you view the past in a new light, please share your reflections below. We always appreciate hearing from you. And if you have not done so already, make sure to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you never miss our next story from the concealed chapters of history.